We think our technology puts us at the top of the food chain, but in the wild, we're just protein. I'm Christopher, and today, we're counting down the scariest animal attacks ever recorded. I've compiled these cases to get progressively darker as we go. By the final entry, you'll realize the scariest sound in the world isn't a scream. It's the silence right before the strike. Let's begin. It was September 3rd, 2015, and the temperature at a national park, Alberta, had dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit by 10 in the evening. The Bow River Valley lay below the ridge, and somewhere beyond the tree line, as wildlife frequently moves through the broader Bow Valley corridor, something large was moving. Rachel Summers was 34 years old and worked as a graphic designer in Calgary, Alberta. She had driven to Banff for a long weekend camping trip with two colleagues from her office. She was typically organized, but on this trip she decided a short walk to the bear locker wasn't worth the cold. The national park manages a closely monitored population of grizzly bears within the Canadian Rockies. The park posts food storage regulations at the entrance kiosk, at the registration booth, and on laminated cards at every campsite. The rule is simple. All food, cooking equipment, and scented items including toiletries must be stored in the designated metal bear-proof lockers at each site or locked inside a vehicle. The regulation exists because a bear that finds food near humans becomes food-conditioned, and a food-conditioned bear returns with increasing boldness until it eventually has to be destroyed. The group arrived on September 2nd and received the food storage briefing from a warden at the kiosk, who mentioned specifically that a grizzly had been flagged as active in the campground corridor that week. Rachel's two companions followed the rules each evening, placing their food and toiletries in the steel locker before going to sleep. Rachel did not. On both the first and second nights, she kept a bag of granola bars, a sleeve of crackers, and a container of trail mix inside her sleeping bag. She also kept a lip balm and a travel-size hand lotion inside her tent bag. Both carry scent that a grizzly can detect at considerable distance. A wildlife camera on the adjacent trail had recorded the sub-adult male grizzly, approximately 4 years old and 280 pounds, ranging the campground perimeter on 6 of the previous 14 nights. A grizzly's sense of smell is estimated to be 7 times stronger than a bloodhound's, and can detect food from over a mile away, even through packaging. Food-conditioned bears lose their natural avoidance behavior and approach camps with increasing boldness. He had been flagged 3 weeks earlier as food-conditioned after raiding an unsecured cooler at a nearby picnic area. He had been getting closer every time. By the night of September 3rd, the bear had shown increasing boldness around developed areas compared to earlier sightings. On the third night, Rachel's colleagues went to bed around 10:30. Rachel fell asleep with the food bag alongside her in the sleeping bag, as she had the 2 previous nights. At some point between 1 and 2 in the morning, the grizzly entered the campsite. After moving along the perimeter of the campsite and pausing intermittently, he approached the tent, drawn by the concentrated scent from inside. He pushed his nose along the base of the tent wall, working slowly around the perimeter until he found the strongest concentration near the foot of the sleeping bag. Then, he bit and pulled. The first tear opened the rainfly and a section of the inner wall simultaneously. The sound was sharp and sudden in the quiet campground. Rachel woke immediately. She sat upright, and the cold air hit her. The beam of her headlamp, which she had left within reach, was knocked sideways and lit up the collapsed side of the tent. The bear's head was already partially through the torn section. She screamed. The bear reacted to the sudden movement and noise. He lunged forward into the tent and bit down on her right forearm, which she had raised instinctively in front of her face. The bite was deep through the muscle. He then pulled back, tearing the sleeping bag and pulling Rachel partly against the opening of the tent. Her right shoulder caught the tent frame on the way out and wrenched hard. She ended up on the cold ground outside the tent, face up. It was Rachel's colleagues who broke the standoff. They had woken to the screaming, and both began shouting at full volume from inside their tents. The bear paused over her briefly, head low and breathing heavily, then shifted attention toward the shouting from the other tents. He then moved back across the campsite toward the tree line. Several minutes later, a warden's truck arrived with headlights and a bear banger, and the grizzly disappeared into the forest at the eastern edge of the campground. Wardens reached Rachel at 1:52 in the morning She had serious lacerations to her right forearm and shoulder, and blunt trauma to her upper body. She was transported to a hospital and underwent surgery that morning. In the days that followed, despite repeated surgical debridement and broad-spectrum intravenous antibiotics, widespread muscle devitalization and contamination led to a rapidly advancing necrotizing infection. Her condition deteriorated into septic shock. She died 6 days after the attack. The investigation concluded that unsecured food and scented products inside her tent were a primary contributing factor in the bear's approach. The grizzly was located the following afternoon and euthanized. It was the morning of July 29, 2017, along a narrow channel in the Okavango Delta in Botswana, where the water moved slowly between walls of papyrus and the air smelled of mud and reeds. The channel was quiet, the surface was still. Nothing visible suggested any danger. That stillness is part of what makes the Delta so disarming. Priya Sharma, 29, was a travel vlogger from Mumbai, India, with a growing YouTube channel focused on solo female travel. She had approximately 22,000 subscribers and was building a series on destinations in sub-Saharan Africa. She was organized and detail-oriented in her planning, but she had no experience with crocodile habitats and had not researched the specific risks of Mokoro travel in the Delta. That gap between general preparation and specific knowledge is something I come back to often in these cases. Priya had planned the trip carefully, booked a reputable guide, and done the work. But she had not understood what the Delta specifically required of her, and that specific gap was the one that mattered. Her guide was a local operator named Cabo Sitol, 44, who had been running Mokoro tours in the Delta for over a decade. Cabo gave the same briefing every morning. Stay seated, keep hands and arms inside the canoe. At all times, do not lean toward the water. He explained that Nile crocodiles in the Delta were not always visible and could approach from directly below the surface. Priya had been filming throughout the trip, holding her camera over the side of the Mokoro to capture low-angle footage. Cabo had corrected her twice on the first day. She adjusted briefly each time, then returned to the same position. This is the part of the story that I find genuinely difficult to understand. The warning had been given clearly, more than once, and the reason behind it was explained, and yet the habit continued. I think there is something about calm water that makes people feel safe in a way that open savanna does not, and that false sense of calm is exactly what makes crocodile habitats so consistently deadly. A lion on the plains is visible. Nile crocodiles are ambush predators that wait submerged with only their eyes and nostrils above the waterline, detecting movement through vibration in the water before striking upward with explosive speed. An adult Nile crocodile can reach 16 feet in length and weigh over 1,500 pounds, with a bite force among the strongest of any living animal. What makes them particularly lethal is not the initial strike, it is what comes after. On the morning of July 29th, Priya was filming a slow pan across the water surface, leaning forward with her camera extended over the side of the Mokoro. Cabo told her to sit back. She held up a hand and continued filming. The crocodile had been stationary beneath the surface, less than 30 feet from the canoe. The strike came from below. The animal lunged upward and seized her right arm just below the elbow, pulling her forward and partially out of the Mokoro. Cabo grabbed her left arm with both hands and pulled hard. For a moment there was a struggle, Priya partially in the water, Cabo pulling from one side, the crocodile from the other. He was fighting with everything he had. The crocodile began to roll. The torque broke Cabo's grip. Priya went into the water. Cabo used the paddle to strike the surface repeatedly, but the crocodile had already submerged with her. The channel went still within seconds. The same stillness that had been there all morning returned as if nothing had happened. A response team arrived approximately 2 hours later. Priya's camera was recovered, floating near the reeds. Her body was found the following morning, partially submerged beneath a root system roughly a quarter-mile downstream. Post-mortem findings confirmed death by drowning, with significant trauma to the right arm and shoulder. The medical examiner noted that drowning was the primary cause. She had been held underwater, not killed by the initial strike. Cabo was cleared of negligence. He had given the warning, repeated it, and when the moment came, he had held on until the physics of the situation took that option away from him. Priya's family was notified through the Indian consulate. Her final video, uploaded 2 days before the incident, showed her boarding the Mokoro at sunrise, describing the Delta as the most peaceful place she had ever been. She was not wrong about the beauty of it. She just did not know what was underneath it. It was November 21st, 2017, on a red dirt track through the Serenera Valley in Tanzania's Serengeti National Park, where the dry season grass runs shoulder high along the road edges. It was the kind of morning that looks like nothing until it becomes everything. Heidi Bruckner was 38, a physiotherapy assistant from Zurich, who had worked over a decade at a rehabilitation clinic in the city's 4th district. Colleagues knew her for detailed patient notes, few clinical errors, and reliability in routine. She had saved for this trip over 2 years and planned it with the same precision she applied to work. Structured itinerary, licensed operator out of Arusha, a handwritten journal she had maintained consistently since landing. It was her first solo international trip and her first safari. What her colleagues also knew about Heidi was that she regularly intervened with injured or vulnerable animals. Journal entries from earlier in the trip documented a bird with a wing injury at the lodge perimeter and a stray dog she had fed twice behind the camp kitchen. At home, the habit had produced nothing more costly than time. It was consistent, reinforced, and entirely familiar to her. Their guide, Joseph Nyerere, 41, had worked the circuit for over a decade. They encountered the tortoise, a leopard tortoise, roughly 12 inches across, sitting in the center of the track at a slightly elevated section of road. Joseph told her to remain inside. He named the reason directly. Predators used roadside depressions for cover. The culvert to their right sat several feet below the track surface, its lips screened by dry grass, standing nearly chest high. The tortoise required no intervention. He began repositioning the vehicle. Heidi had already pushed the passenger door open before he could complete the maneuver. Heidi stepped down, crouched, and lifted the tortoise with both hands, holding it slightly away from her body. Joseph scanned the culvert line immediately to the right. He saw a narrow line of grass press flat for an instant, then hold. He held the horn down and shouted at her to get back inside. She turned toward the vehicle, still holding the tortoise, and stepped backward toward the open door. The step caught the lower frame edge. Her footing gave out entirely. She dropped sideways, shoulder first, onto the track surface. The tortoise left her hands and struck the dirt, where it sat without moving. The lioness came out of the culvert in a single uninterrupted movement, no vocalization, covering roughly 20 feet before Heidi had finished falling. A lioness is a heavily built predator capable of sudden, short bursts that can overwhelm an unsteady person. Lionesses use roadside culverts and depressions for shade and concealment, the ambient noise of vehicle traffic masking their presence. From below road level, the closing distance to a person standing outside a stopped vehicle can be under 20 feet. The strike landed across her right shoulder and upper chest. The forelimbs made contact first, driving her flat and pinning her in place before the jaws engaged. The weight and momentum of a large predator at full acceleration against a person already off balance is a structural event, not a blow in any ordinary sense. Heidi's body was driven into the track and rotated. The lioness adjusted grip within seconds, jaws repositioning from the shoulder area to the neck and upper cervical region, finding purchase there. Lionesses kill through compression, crushing the trachea and carotid vessels simultaneously while pressing their full weight onto prey already pinned beneath them. The technique does not require prolonged struggle. Heidi's body was dragged partially toward the culvert as the animal settled. Joseph drove forward with the horn blaring, engine revving, edging toward the culvert. After several seconds, the lioness released and moved to the grass at the edge, maintaining eye contact. He stopped, kept the horn sounding, leaned out, and pulled Heidi into the vehicle. She was unresponsive, with heavy blood transfer inside. He closed the door and drove immediately to Serenera Airstrip while staying in radio contact with emergency responders. The airstrip was reached in approximately 14 minutes. Joseph's radio call had already been logged by park control, and medical personnel were mobilizing as he drove. Heidi was declared deceased shortly after arrival. Cause of death was listed as compressive cervical trauma, consistent with large feline predation. Joseph was interviewed twice by park investigators and remained consistent throughout both accounts. He stated that the door had been opened without instruction, that Heidi had exited the vehicle before it could be repositioned, and that a direct verbal warning had been given and acknowledged prior to the attack. It was June 17, 2016, and the golden light stretched across Kiawakapu Beach in Maui. where the seabed sloped gradually before meeting darker reef structures farther offshore. Those deeper reef zones were patrolled by tiger sharks, whose movements brought them periodically into shallower water as daylight faded. Elira Santos, 28, a dental receptionist from Albuquerque, had never traveled abroad before. With her husband Jonah, 31, a cautious HVAC technician she had saved meticulously for their Hawaiian honeymoon. Just 3 days into their marriage, they splurged on a Sunset Beach photo shoot with a freelance photographer who offered discounted rates for off-peak slots, promising romantic shots in waist-deep water, a comfort for the couple, neither of whom were strong swimmers. I don't know about you, but knowing that deeper reef structures sit just beyond the shoreline always gives me pause. Tiger sharks are among the ocean's most adaptable predators, with adults reaching lengths of 10 to 14 feet and capable of exerting immense bite force, sufficient to cut through bone and hard shells. The photographer positioned them several yards from shore, in calm, shallow water where the depth reached waist level. At that distance, most people would assume they were completely safe. Elira's flowing white dress created an ethereal effect as it floated around her legs, and Jonah had overcome his initial awkwardness about posing for professional photos. The session had been progressing smoothly for nearly 15 minutes when the photographer suggested more dynamic shots involving splashing and movement to capture the golden light reflecting off disturbed water. Several beachgoers had stopped to watch the romantic scene unfold, some taking their own photos of the picturesque couple. What none of them realized was that a tiger shark, measuring roughly 12 feet in length, had been methodically hunting along the reef edge since late afternoon, following its instinctual pattern of moving into shallower waters as daylight faded. Their repeated splashing and the contrasting movement of Elira's white dress against the darker water created exactly the type of irregular disturbance that triggers investigative behavior in tiger shark. Now that part really stands out to me. The attack came without warning as Jonah lifted Elira for what was meant to be the final shot of their session. The tiger shark surged upward from deeper water, propelled by rapid tail strokes as it crossed from the reef edge into the shallows. The impact threw Elira off balance, and the shark's jaws closed on her left hip and upper thigh. The photographer witnessed the sudden strike. Though there was no warning before the predator's attack, the shark's serrated teeth tore through the thigh and pelvis, causing catastrophic damage and likely severing the femoral artery. Elira's scream was cut short as the force of the attack pulled her underwater, and bleeding began immediately from the inflicted wound. Jonah's initial confusion turned to horror as he realized what was happening beneath the churning surface. He lunged forward, grabbing Elira under her arms and attempting to pull her away from the shark, but the predator's grip was absolute. I can't imagine what that moment must have felt like for him. The surrounding water darkened rapidly with blood as the shark released its grip and moved back into deeper water, leaving Elira in the shallows with critical injuries. Elira emerged from the water unconscious, her body going into immediate shock from catastrophic blood loss. Jonah dragged her toward shore, screaming for help as blood poured from the massive wound in heavy, pulsing streams that left a trail across the sand. An off-duty firefighter among the beachgoers rushed forward with towels, attempting to apply pressure to the wound, but the injury was too high on her torso and too severe to control with basic first aid. The femoral artery had been completely severed, and her body was losing blood faster than any emergency response could address. A witness called 911, but traffic delays meant paramedics didn't reach the remote beach access for several minutes. Elira had lost consciousness shortly after reaching shore and went into cardiac arrest soon after. Despite aggressive resuscitation efforts, she was pronounced dead from hypovolemic shock, secondary to massive trauma and blood loss. I can't help but wonder if stricter guidelines for offshore photo sessions might have helped. Elira and Jonah were careful, inexperienced swimmers, yet the unpredictability of tiger sharks makes me question how preventable this truly was. The incident prompted immediate beach closures and increased patrols over several days, drawing widespread media attention, though many details were later limited or removed from public reports for privacy. The photographer ceased offering ocean sessions and returned exclusively to land-based wedding photography. The couple's carefully planned dream vacation had lasted exactly 4 days, ending in the type of tragedy that transforms a paradise destination into a place of unimaginable loss. It was July 18th, 2015, and the late afternoon sun filtered through the towering pines of Yellowstone National Park, where the summer tourist season had brought thousands of visitors eager to photograph the park's famous wildlife. The parking area near Dunraven Pass was crowded with vehicles as families hoped to catch glimpses of the black bears and grizzlies that frequently foraged in the area's berry-rich meadow. The park had thoughtfully provided a mandatory safety orientation for all visitors. Clara Martinez had skipped it. Clara Martinez was a 27-year-old marketing coordinator from from Phoenix, Arizona, whose vacation planning consisted primarily of researching the most Instagram-worthy locations rather than understanding the environments she intended to visit. She had skipped the orientation specifically to get to scenic locations before other tourists, which, in retrospect, was an interesting set of priorities. Clara had spent the morning driving through the park's interior roads, frustrated by the distance between herself and the animals she encountered. Other tourists photographed elk and bison from the required 25-yard minimum distance without complaint. Clara found this approach insufficiently dramatic when she spotted a large grizzly bear foraging near the tree line. She saw an opportunity for the kind of close-up shot that would generate serious social media engagement and made a series of decisions that would also generate serious consequences. The bear, a mature female grizzly weighing approximately 300 to 350 pounds, had been feeding on huckleberries in a meadow adjacent to the parking area. Park rangers had been monitoring the animal throughout the week, noting her increasing comfort around human activity and her tendency to investigate vehicles for food sources. Clara had signed a form at the park entrance acknowledging that feeding wildlife was both illegal and dangerous. She then drove to the meadow and prepared to feed the wildlife. She parked approximately 30 feet from the bear, rolled down her passenger window, and began making clicking sounds while waving a granola bar out the window. The bear looked up from her foraging, immediately focusing on the scent of processed food. From the bear's perspective, a person had parked nearby and was waving food at her. This was not a confusing situation. Grizzly bears possess an extraordinary sense of smell, capable of detecting food sources from over a mile away. An adult female can weigh between 290 and 400 pounds, with powerful limbs capable of propelling them at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour. Their claws can reach up to 4 inches in length, and their bite force exceeds 1,200 pounds per square inch. The bear approached with deliberate steps, her massive head swaying as she tested the air. Clara held the granola bar further outside the window, attempting to coax the bear closer for a better shot. The bear rose on her hind legs, placed her front paws on the car's doorframe, and brought her massive head level with Clara's window. The bear's weight caused the car door to creak ominously, her claws leaving deep gouges in the paint as she repositioned for a better angle at the food. When Clara tried to pull the granola bar back inside the vehicle, the bear lunged toward the open window, pressing her head and shoulders against the door. The bear's claws raked across Clara's chest and arms as she struggled, tearing through her shirt and opening deep lacerations across her torso. Clara screamed and tried to push the bear away. The bear, weighing approximately 350 pounds, was not pushed away. Clara managed to open the driver's side door and attempted to escape, but the bear's weight pressed against the door frame, limiting her movement and trapping her against the passenger seat. The animal's massive paw struck Clara across the side of her head with devastating force, fracturing her skull and sending her glasses flying. The blow caused immediate severe trauma, her vision darkening as she slumped against the seat. The bear bit down on Clara's left shoulder and neck, powerful jaws crushing through muscle and bone. The bite severed her carotid artery, and blood began pouring from the wound at an alarming rate. Clara's attempts to scream were reduced to gurgling sounds as the bear shook her violently, the way a predator dispatches prey. Other tourists in the parking area began honking their horns and shouting, but the commotion came too late. The bear had dragged Clara partially out of the vehicle through the driver's side door, her body limp and unresponsive. By the time park rangers arrived with bear spray and firearms, Clara had lost consciousness from massive blood loss and traumatic injuries. Emergency medical personnel arrived within 8 minutes of the initial 911 call, but Clara was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was determined to be exsanguination from the severed carotid artery, combined with catastrophic head trauma and crush injuries to her chest and neck. Park authorities euthanized the bear after determining that her escalating food conditioning posed an unacceptable risk to visitor safety. Clara, who had created that food conditioning through deliberate and illegal feeding, had paid the ultimate price. The incident prompted Yellowstone to implement stricter enforcement of wildlife interaction regulation and increase the penalties for feeding animals. It was July 15, 2016, along a rural highway in Trang Province, Thailand. Traffic had slowed under the afternoon heat because a large king cobra was stretched across the road. Niran Pechkul, 34, was known around nearby areas as someone who could deal with snakes. He worked as a motorcycle mechanic, but on the side, he helped remove snakes from homes and small properties. He didn't have formal training, but he had done it enough times that he trusted himself. Small bites and close calls didn't scare him anymore. They just became stories he told. To me, it feels like this is where things start to go wrong. When you've done something enough times that you stop thinking about what could actually happen. That afternoon, Niran was riding home when he saw the traffic. He moved between the stopped vehicles and saw the cobra lying across both lanes. It was large, thick, and already watching everything around it. Some people had stepped out of their cars. A few were filming. Others just stood there, unsure what to do. I've seen situations like this before. Once people stop and gather, it usually makes things worse. The snake had its head raised slightly, hood partly open, following movement. A truck driver nearby warned people to stay back. A few others agreed and said it was better to wait, but Niran stepped forward and said he could move it. Honestly, this feels like one of those moments where everything depends on a single choice, whether you step in or just leave it alone. He walked behind the snake, planning to grab it the way he had seen in videos. But as he got closer, the cobra turned toward him, its head lifted higher, body tensing. Watching videos makes it look easy. Real life isn't like that. Niran moved quickly and tried to grab the head, but his hand landed too far back. The cobra reacted instantly. It twisted and struck. The first bite hit his left forearm as he raised it. Niran pulled back immediately and lost his grip. The cobra recoiled, hood flared wide, holding its ground. As he stumbled backward, his movement brought him close again. The snake struck a second time in quick succession, a defensive reaction rather than a pursuit. From what I know, once something goes wrong with a snake like this, the situation escalates fast. He managed to move a few steps, but something was already off. At first, it was subtle. He looked unsteady. His movements slowed. When he tried to speak, his words didn't come out clearly. Then his breathing began to change, becoming shallow and strained. People around him didn't know what to do. Some shouted, others moved away. One person called for help. I don't think people freeze because they don't care. They just don't know how to react in a situation like this. Niran collapsed near the side of the road. The cobra lowered itself and moved away into the nearby vegetation. On the ground, his condition continued to deteriorate. He remained conscious for a short time, but he couldn't respond properly. His breathing grew weaker, each breath more labored than the last. Within around 15 minutes of the bite, it had become critically shallow. Emergency services arrived shortly after, finding him barely responsive and showing signs of severe neurotoxic envenomation. He was placed in an ambulance, but his condition deteriorated during transport. His breathing grew increasingly irregular as paralysis spread, and despite efforts to support his airway, he went into respiratory failure. He was pronounced dead at the hospital shortly after. Arrival, approximately 40 minutes after the initial bite. The incident didn't get much attention. It was reported simply as a snake handling accident. People who knew him remembered him as someone who helped others, but also someone who got too comfortable doing something dangerous. I think that's what makes this hard. He wasn't trying to do something reckless. He just believed he could handle it. For me, this feels preventable. He didn't have to step in. People were already waiting, and help could have been called. I don't think he meant to take a big risk, but he still chose to. With something like a king cobra, there's almost no room for mistakes. Sometimes the safer move is just to leave it alone, even if you think you can handle it. It was July 28, 2018, and the Louisiana summer was doing what Louisiana summers do, pressing heat and humidity into every corner of the day. The air thick enough that even standing still felt like effort. By late afternoon outside Baton Rouge, the light had gone gold and heavy, and the surface of the water in Eric Landry's backyard enclosure sat completely still, reflecting nothing. Eric, 38, had built the enclosure himself over the course of about 2 years. A 20-foot long, 4-foot deep structure with a water section that took up roughly half the total space. He was a detail-oriented man by nature, the kind of person who documented his builds and took quiet pride in doing things properly. Louisiana has a long-established alligator, farming and handling industry, and private ownership of American alligators, while regulated, existed within a framework that experienced handlers could navigate. Eric had the permits. He had the paperwork. What he had built was, on paper, compliant. The animal he kept inside it was an American alligator, approximately 11 feet long and over 500 pounds. A species that has remained essentially unchanged for 37 million years because nothing about its design needed improving. I think about that sometimes. An animal that has outlasted almost everything else on this continent, and someone decided to keep one in their backyard in Baton Rouge. American alligators are ambush predators, and their entire anatomy is organized around that single strategy. Their eyes and nostrils sit at the very top of the skull, allowing them to remain almost entirely submerged while maintaining full sensory awareness of the surface above. They can hold their breath for up to 2 hours. In murky water, they are functionally invisible, and when they strike, the movement from stillness to full contact is among the fastest predatory actions in the animal kingdom. Studies have clocked the initial lunge at under 150 milliseconds. The bite force of a large adult exceeds 2,000 pounds per square inch, among the highest recorded for any living animal. What follows the bite is the death roll, a full-body rotation used to disorient prey and drag it below the surface. It is not a defensive behavior, it is a feeding behavior. The water in the enclosure had developed significant algae and sediment buildup over the preceding weeks, reducing visibility below the surface to near zero. Eric was aware of it. Cleaning was on his list, but on July 28th, he entered the enclosure for a late afternoon feeding before the water had been cleared, approaching the water line carrying food, in conditions that were meaningfully different from the ones he'd grown accustomed to. No overhead barriers, no external feeding system, no protected approach path had been installed. The enclosure was well built, but the safety architecture around the feeding process had never been completed. Eric was at the water's edge when the alligator came up from below the surface with no visible warning. The bite was immediate, followed by the death roll, a full-body rotation that pulled him toward the deeper section of the enclosure. Disturbed water, mud displacement, and drag marks told the story of what followed. He had no barrier between himself and the water. In conditions where he couldn't see the animal had seen him perfectly. A nearby resident reported a sudden splash and a brief disturbance, then silence. Eric was reported missing later that evening. Authorities searched the enclosure and recovered remains from the water. The alligator was euthanized due to immediate risk. The case was later referenced in regional safety discussions, though it received limited public coverage. What stays with me about Eric's case is the water visibility. That single factor, sediment and algae obscuring the surface, transformed a dangerous situation into a fatal one. He couldn't see the animal. The animal could detect him perfectly. That asymmetry in a shared space with no barriers left no margin at all. It's the kind of detail that seems almost incidental until you understand what it actually meant. It was June 12, 2016, at a small private game reserve in Limpopo Province, South Africa, approximately 90 miles north of Johannesburg. The reserve covered approximately 2,000 acres of bushveld, a mix of grassland, scattered acacia trees, and dense thickets. Rachel Dalton was 29, a wildlife veterinary intern from London, doing a 6-month internship at the reserve. She was passionate about wildlife conservation and had dreamed of working in Africa since childhood. She was confident, capable, and eager to prove herself. Rachel was part of a 2-person team conducting a routine health check on the reserve's lion pride. The operation involved darting an adult female from a vehicle, then approaching on foot to collect samples while the lion was sedated. Rachel had participated in 3 previous darting operations, always assisting the senior vet. This was her first time taking the lead, with the senior vet supervising from the vehicle. She was perhaps overconfident, eager to demonstrate she could handle the responsibility. The adult female had been darted at 5:15 p.m. and gone down within 8 minutes. However, the pride's dominant male had been circling the area, pacing and vocalizing unusual behavior. The senior vet suggested waiting for him to move off. Rachel argued they needed to work quickly before the sedation wore off. The senior vet reluctantly agreed, but insisted on strict conditions. He would stay in the vehicle with the engine running, and Rachel must retreat immediately if the male showed any approach behavior. Rachel exited the vehicle at 5:28 p.m., carrying a medical kit. The lioness lay 40 feet away. The male was approximately 80 feet beyond her, partially obscured by acacia trees. Rachel walked confidently toward the lioness and glanced at the male once, but didn't perceive him as a threat. Unknown to Rachel, the male and lioness had mated recently, and he was exhibiting mate-guarding behavior, one of the most dangerous behavioral states in a lion. As Rachel knelt beside the lioness and opened her kit, the male stopped pacing and stood completely still, watching her. His tail twitched slowly. Adult male lions weigh 350 to 550 pounds, with massive shoulder and neck muscles designed for taking down large prey. They have canine teeth up to 3 inches long, and bite force powerful enough to crush bone. Highly territorial and protective, especially of females they've recently mated with. They can sprint up to 50 miles per hour and cover 30 to 40 feet in under 2 seconds. Rachel placed her hand on the lioness's flank to check her breathing. The contact appeared to trigger the charge. The senior vet saw the male move and immediately shouted a warning. Rachel's head snapped up. She saw the massive lion charging at full speed through the grass. She stood, dropped her equipment, and raised her arms. It didn't matter. The male hit her like a freight train. The impact knocked her backward and down. She landed hard on her back, the air driven from her lungs. The male was on top of her instantly, his weight pinning her to the ground. His front paws pressed down on her shoulders. Claws extended, puncturing through her shirt into muscle. Rachel screamed, a high-pitched, desperate sound. The male's jaws opened wide and clamped onto her face. Upper canines sank into her forehead. lower canines into her jaw and neck, her forehead fractured. Her jaw dislocated with an audible pop. Blood poured from the puncture wounds. The male bit down harder, crushing bone. Rachel's sound stopped. Her jaw was crushed, and her airway was filling with blood. He shook his head violently, whipping her head side to side. Her right cheek ripped open from ear to mouth, exposing teeth and bone. The senior vet threw the vehicle into gear and drove directly toward the male, honking the horn and shouting. The male released Rachel's face and looked up at the vehicle, roaring. The senior vet revved the engine and edged closer, then blasted an air horn twice. The male flinched, roared again, then finally backed off and moved away. Rachel lay unconscious on her back. Her forehead showed 4 deep puncture wounds with visible skull fractures beneath. Her right cheek was torn open from ear to mouth, exposing teeth, jawbone, and the inside of her mouth, with portions of tissue missing. Her jaw was dislocated and fractured in 2 places. Her nose was crushed. Her left eye socket showed fracturing. Deep puncture wounds covered her neck and throat. Her shoulders bore deep claw wounds. The senior vet radioed the reserve's main office at 5:32 p.m., less than 4 minutes after the attack. A medical helicopter was dispatched. He dragged Rachel into the back of the vehicle, applied pressure to her facial wounds with towels, and tried to stabilize her airway while keeping watch on the male. The helicopter arrived at 6:14 p.m. Paramedics began advanced life support, intubation, IV fluids, blood pressure management. Rachel was loaded at 6:31 p.m. for a 35-minute flight to a trauma center. Her condition deteriorated during the flight. Blood pressure dropped critically. Her airway remained compromised despite intubation. She died in the helicopter at 6:58 p.m. from massive cranial fractures, intracranial hemorrhage, and airway compromise. The male was not euthanized. Reserve policy held that wild animals acting naturally would not be killed unless they posed an ongoing threat. He had been protecting his mate, a natural behavior. The attack was deemed the result of human error. The case was ruled an accidental death. It was September 14th, 2017, and the evening light was fading fast over Norris Geyser Basin, casting long shadows across the white mineral deposits that surrounded the thermal features. Elliot Crane and Trent Mullen had less than 2 hours before a mountain lion would reduce their late-night adventure into a scene of carnage. Elliot was a 19-year-old college freshman from Denver, Colorado, studying environmental science. His high school yearbook had dubbed him most likely to climb Everest, a reference to his tendency to push boundaries that occasionally crossed into recklessness. His roommate, Trent, 20, was studying the same major. Friends described their dynamic as complementary. Elliot proposed adventures, while Trent calculated risks. That evening, however, Trent's usual caution had been worn down by 3 days of what Elliot called boring boardwalk tourism. The trip had been planned as a celebration before fall semester finals. Both young men had grown up camping and hiking with their families, giving them confidence in wilderness settings that perhaps exceeded their actual experience. Elliot had specifically mentioned wanting to see the thermal features without crowds, away from the prescribed tourist paths. He had researched online forums where users bragged about accessing restricted areas after dark, describing surreal landscapes lit only by moonlight and the eerie glow of superheated water. That afternoon, both young men had signed the standard park entry waiver and received a map clearly marking restricted zones. A ranger at the visitor center had specifically mentioned increased mountain lion activity in the northern thermal areas, advising visitors to stay on designated paths and avoid hiking after sunset. Mountain lions, also called cougars or pumas, are solitary ambush predators that can weigh up to 160 pounds and measure over 8 feet from nose to tail. Their powerful jaws deliver concentrated pressure, capable of crushing the base of the skull, causing cervical dislocation or severe puncture trauma. They returned just after 9 p.m., parking Trent's Honda Civic in a maintenance area out of sight. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s, their breath visible as they passed a locked gate. The sulfur smell was strong, and steam from thermal features drifted across the slick boardwalks. Elliot led with his phone's LED light along the service road toward the restricted section. About 20 minutes in, Trent stopped to photograph a vivid thermal pool, while Elliot continued toward a cluster of geysers he had marked earlier, widening the gap between them to around 30 feet. Neither noticed the tawny shape moving just beyond their phone light. The attack came suddenly. One moment, Elliot was stepping carefully along the boardwalk. The next, a 150-pound mountain lion launched itself from the darkness, covering the distance in a single bound. The impact knocked Elliot face first onto the wooden planks. The cougar's front claws dug deep into his shoulders, puncturing through his jacket and hoodie to tear into muscle tissue. Elliot managed a strangled cry before the cat's jaws clamped onto the back of his neck, delivering a crushing bite aimed at the cervical spine. Trent screamed and rushed forward, still holding his phone. As the sudden noise and movement closed in, the cougar released almost immediately, abandoning its grip rather than attempting to defend the kill in an unfamiliar thermal environment. Elliot lay face down on the boardwalk, his arms slack and unmoving. Blood began pooling beneath his shoulders. Trent swung the device instinctively as he approached. The cougar had already disengaged, backing off the boardwalk with a low growl before turning away. It slipped into the steam-shrouded darkness beyond the path. The entire contact lasted only seconds. Trent dropped beside Elliot, whose breathing had become shallow and irregular. There were no additional claw rakes or prolonged mauling injuries, only deep puncture wounds and compression trauma from the initial impact, consistent with typical mountain lion cervical attacks. Blood seeped steadily between the wooden slats. Trent ran toward the parking area, his phone still in his hand. He reached his car and drove directly to the ranger station. Arriving just before 10 p.m., Mammoth District law enforcement rangers were alerted, and a nearby crew responded, reaching Elliot's location minutes later. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The autopsy report noted severe trauma to the cervical spine, with near-complete spinal cord compromise at C3. Injuries were consistent with puncture wounds and blunt force impact. The medical examiner determined that death resulted from catastrophic neurological damage, with secondary blood loss contributing minimally, and time of death estimated between 9:45 and 9:50 p.m. Park officials tracked the cougar using dogs the following morning, but lost the trail in rocky terrain north of the basin. The animal was never located. Trent Mullen withdrew from school that semester and did not return to complete his degree. The restricted area where the attack occurred remained closed, its warning signs updated to include specific mention of predatory wildlife activity during evening hours. On January 9, 2018, relentless rains had flooded the Shire River floodplain in Chikwawa District, southern Malawi, displacing both families and the massive hippos that usually stayed in the river's deep pools. In the pre-dawn darkness, a 4,000-pound bull hippo moved through the narrow village streets like a living battering ram, its territorial instincts heightened by the cramped mud brick houses. Chimwemwe Kalonga, 34, had spent her life building a modest home and raising 3 children while selling tomatoes and dried fish at a roadside stand. Her husband, Blessings, was away for weeks working seasonal labor at a nearby sugar estate, leaving her to manage alone during the floods that regularly inundated their small village of 120 people. Their home, made of sun-dried mud bricks about 8 inches thick, had a single wooden door of scrap timber and zinc, with 2 small windows secured by shutters. It seemed sturdy enough, until the water and the hippo came. I can't stop picturing that massive hippo squeezing through the narrow village streets, each step shaking the ground, with no way for anyone to get out of its path. The floodwater surrounding the house had risen to about 16 inches, still shallow enough for the family to live normally by. Moving belongings to higher surfaces, Chimwemwe had built a bamboo platform where her children slept safely above the water, while she took a mat on the floor beside them. I can understand why she stayed. She was following what she'd always known, trying to keep her family safe the only way she could. The Shire River is home to one of southern Africa's densest hippopotamus populations. Adult males exceed 4,000 pounds, and their jaws can generate over 8,000 to 12,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crush a small boat or snap a crocodile. Floods often drive these massive animals into human areas, and their defensive instincts make them deadly in confined spaces. Hippos kill more people in Africa than any other large mammal, using curved tusks up to 20 inches long to inflict devastating wounds. Warnings had appeared over the week. Large 4-toed tracks were spotted in the mud, and villagers heard deep grunts and splashes as displaced hippos moved between houses. Residents assumed the animals would avoid humans, but no formal alerts reached Chimwemwe's home, and the danger went largely unnoticed. That night, Chimwemwe fed her children and lay on the floor beside them, near the wall facing the narrow 6-foot gap to the neighbor's house. A bull hippo moved through the corridor, its massive body brushing against the mud brick walls. Its massive body pressed against the flood-weakened wall, forcing the narrow passage to collapse in a cloud of mud, dust, and debris. Heavy fragments struck her head and upper body, opening a deep laceration. But that was only the start. The sudden collapse disoriented the hippo, causing it to stumble into the house's interior, a space far too small for its enormous size. The bamboo sleeping platform tipped violently, sending the three children tumbling in different directions. Just imagining that tiny child landing right in front of the hippo while the older siblings frantically scramble. It makes my chest tighten, thinking about how terrifying and helpless that moment must have felt. Dazed and bleeding, Chimwemwe struggled to her knees and saw the massive animal less than 3 feet from her. She lunged for her youngest child, but the movement occurred as the hippo reacted defensively in the confined space. It shifted its head with heavy, forceful movement. Its jaws opened to nearly 150 degrees, tusks flashing, and clamped down with crushing force. The impact lifted her off the ground, slammed her against the wall, and tore through muscle and bone. I keep picturing that moment. The hippo's bulk filling the tiny room, Chimwemwe trying to shield her child. The sound of breaking bones and crumbling bricks. It's suffocating just to imagine, every movement leaving no room to escape. Chimwemwe died within minutes from catastrophic internal injuries, calling for her children as she lost consciousness. Her daughter, Tia Mike, rescued her siblings with neighbors' help. Hours later, the authorities recovered Chimwemwe's body. Blessings returned 2 days later to a destroyed home. About 80 villagers attended the funeral, and though briefly reported, the tragedy quickly faded. The house was rebuilt farther from the river, but Tia Mike reportedly refused to sleep near walls for over a year, a lasting reminder of that night. Even now, thinking about that scene makes my chest tighten. The cramped room, the weight of the hippo, the helplessness of a mother trying to protect her children. It's terrifying how quickly ordinary routines can turn deadly when forces beyond our control collide with the smallest details of daily life. It was July 9th, 2017, and the mid-morning temperature in a park in Wyoming, Idaho, had already reached 72 degrees Fahrenheit. The valley stretched wide and golden under the summer sky, the grass moving in a low wind, and the distant ridgelines shimmering in the heat. A bison herd grazed near the creek. Further out in the meadow, partially obscured by tall grass, a grizzly bear was feeding steadily. Several cars had already pulled into the roadside viewing area. Margaret Elaine Doss was 58 years old and had retired the previous year from a career in human resources management in Scottsdale, Arizona. She had come to the park with her husband as part of a 2-week road trip through the national parks. He would later describe her as someone with a deep, genuine affection for animals who believed that animals could sense a person's calm intentions. She had volunteered at an animal shelter in Scottsdale for years and had told her husband before the trip that she wanted to come home with better wildlife photographs than the ones from her previous visit to that same park 15 years earlier. The Lamar Valley is one of the most productive wildlife watching locations in North America. The National Park Service requires all visitors to maintain at least 100 yards from bears and wolves and 25 yards from all other large wildlife. These are federal legal requirements. Rangers patrol the valley throughout the day. A ranger vehicle was parked at the far end of the pullout when Margaret and her husband arrived. Margaret had a digital camera with a moderate zoom lens and felt the distance was producing images that were too small. She told her husband the bear looked completely calm and that she only wanted to move closer for a better angle. He told her clearly not to. She waited several minutes while the ranger at the far end of the pullout was speaking with another visitor and scanning the meadow through binoculars. The ranger had noticed intermittent movement in the grass that suggested the possibility of a cub, but had not yet confirmed it before Margaret stepped off the road. Margaret stepped off the road shoulder and into the meadow grass, moving slowly and deliberately, the way she moved around nervous dogs at the shelter. She moved more than 100 yards from the road, well inside the required safety distance. The sow's posture changed first. Her head came up sharply, her ears angled back. She gave a short, forceful woof and rocked forward a step. What Margaret did not fully grasp in that moment was that she was now within close range of a mother bear that likely had a cub bedded in the grass between them. At that distance, especially if a cub was nearby, a direct human approach is commonly interpreted as a defensive threat. Mother grizzlies account for a significant portion of serious bear attacks in North America because they respond instantly to perceived threats near cubs. The bear surged forward. The charge showed no prolonged hesitation, typical of some bluff displays. It was fast and direct. She covered the distance in a few seconds. Margaret turned when she heard the sudden rush through the grass and saw the movement in her peripheral vision. She attempted to run, but managed only a step or two before the bear reached her. At the far end of the pullout, the ranger shouted and ran toward the road edge, bringing up the launcher he had already been holding after noticing possible cub movement in the grass. The charge detonated between the sow and the road edge, but she was already within striking distance. As the sow veered, her right forepaw struck Margaret across the upper back and shoulder in a powerful swiping motion. The impact knocked Margaret forward into the grass. She fell hard and remained face down, stunned. The bear hovered for a brief second over her, huffing sharply, then pivoted away, returning quickly to the area where the cub was concealed. She positioned herself between the cub and the road and did not re-engage. The ranger reached Margaret within moments and called for the medical unit. The wound extended from Margaret's left shoulder blade toward her lower back in a deep, ragged tear that disrupted multiple layers of muscle and included puncture wounds consistent with a brief bite, introducing significant contamination into the underlying tissue. She was conscious but disoriented and showing signs of shock. A park medical unit arrived within minutes. She was stabilized on scene, transported by ground ambulance to Mammoth Hot Springs for transfer, and then airlifted to a medical center in Idaho Falls. She underwent surgery that afternoon for wound cleaning, tissue repair, and aggressive debridement. She initially responded well to treatment. Over the next 2 days, however, extensive devitalized tissue and contamination from the wound led to complications requiring additional surgical debridement. Despite intravenous antibiotics and additional surgical intervention, she developed a severe systemic infection. Her condition deteriorated, and she died on July 13th from septic shock related to the traumatic injuries. The authorities referenced the incident in updated visitor safety messaging at the park entry stations the following season. It was June 18th, 2018, when the late afternoon sun began its descent over northern Australia's remote coastline in Western Australia. The small, unnamed beach was located roughly 30 miles from the nearest town of Carnarvon, accessible only by a rough dirt road. Alex Morrison, a 22-year-old medical student from Brisbane, had driven up the coast with 3 friends, Jake, Tom, and Sarah, for a week-long camping trip. They had spent 3 days exploring isolated beaches. Alex was an experienced swimmer and had grown up swimming on Australia's Gold Coast. Unlike the others, Alex was not a photographer or blogger. He was simply a young man on holiday, about to enter his final year of medical school. He had planned to specialize in emergency medicine. The group arrived around 4 p.m., setting up camp approximately 100 feet from water. The beach featured a gentle slope, with a sandbar visible roughly 250 feet offshore. Beyond the sandbar, the ocean floor dropped sharply into depths exceeding 40 feet. The area had no shark nets, no lifeguards, and no warning signs. Earlier that day, local fishermen working approximately 2 miles south had reported seeing large schools of baitfish moving north. The migration attracted larger predators, including sharks. As sunset approached around 6:15 p.m., with approximately 45 minutes of light remaining, Alex decided to go for a long swim. His friends remained on the beach. Jake declined, saying he was tired. Tom said the water looked sketchy, with birds diving offshore. Sarah told him to be careful. Alex laughed off their concerns. Alex waded in and began swimming straight out. He passed through breaking waves near the sandbar and continued into calmer water beyond. His friends watched for several minutes, then returned to camp. By 6:35 p.m., Alex was approximately 220 feet from shore, well beyond the sandbar in water, roughly 35 feet deep. The sun was low, creating prime feeding time for marine predators. Alex paused and began treading water, floating while looking back at the beach. He remained stationary for approximately 3 to 4 minutes. Unknown to Alex, he had positioned himself directly above a large school of baitfish. The water column beneath him held thousands of sardines. These fish had attracted a mature great white shark patrolling the drop-off zone. The great white shark is the ocean's most formidable predatory fish, with mature adults reaching 11 to 16 feet and weighing 1,500 to 2,400 pounds. Great whites are ambush predators that often attack from below. During dawn and dusk, They enter peak hunting periods. Their teeth are serrated and measure up to 3 inches. The great white detected Alex's presence from roughly 45 feet below. His silhouette against the surface appeared as potential prey. The shark began its approach, angling upward and accelerating to an estimated 22 miles per hour. Alex never saw the attack. The shark struck from directly below in a vertical rush, jaws already opening. The shark's head broke the surface, and its jaws clamped down on Alex's lower torso, hips, and upper thighs. The impact was comparable to being struck by a small vehicle. The bite was devastating. The shark's upper jaw carved through Alex's lower abdomen and groin area, while the lower jaw secured his buttocks and upper thighs. The bite removed a massive amount of tissue, a severe avulsion wound. Both femoral arteries were severed completely. The pelvis sustained fractures, though the primary damage was slicing and tearing from serrated teeth. The shark held the bite for roughly 3 seconds before releasing and dropping back beneath the surface. This behavior is typical of great white investigatory feeding: bite, release, and retreat to assess. Alex surfaced after the initial bite, his body in immediate shock. The water turned dark red as blood poured from massive wounds. He attempted to call out, but managed only a weak cry before losing consciousness. Jake, looking toward the water, saw Alex jump briefly, then saw the water turn red. He shouted to the others, and all 3 ran toward the shoreline, but they were 220 feet away. Blood loss caused Alex's blood pressure to drop to critical levels within approximately 60 to 90 seconds, causing loss of consciousness. The official cause of death was exsanguination, complicated by drowning. While Alex sank and would have taken water into his lungs, the blood loss was so severe that he was effectively dead before drowning occurred. Alex's body sank and disappeared beneath the surface approximately 2 to 3 minutes after the strike. The shark did not immediately return, and based on the body's condition, did not feed further. Alex's friends called emergency services at approximately 6:42 p.m. A rescue helicopter arrived at 7:15 p.m. and began searching with spotlights. The search continued through the evening. Alex's body was located by a fishing vessel at approximately 8:30 a.m. the following morning, drifting roughly 1.5 miles north. The condition confirmed a single massive bite consistent with a large great white shark. In the days that followed, fisheries officials deployed monitoring equipment but did not attempt to track or destroy the shark. Great whites are a protected species, and fatal attacks do not automatically trigger culling. Authorities closed the beach and posted warning signs. It was August 17, 2014, and the Mojave Desert heat had already pushed past 104 degrees by mid-morning, baking the cracked asphalt outside Pahrump, Nevada, into something that shimmered at the edges. The kind of heat that makes the air feel thick, like it's pressing down on you. Inside Daniel Reeves's detached garage, a single box fan pushed warm air in slow circles, doing almost nothing against the temperature. Daniel, 34, was a freelance auto mechanic who operated out of that same garage. Engine parts stacked along one wall, tools hanging from pegboard and tucked against the far end. Row of modified enclosures he'd built himself from stacked glass tanks and wooden framing. He was the kind of man who preferred animals to most people, methodical in his routines and quietly proud of the systems he'd built. Nevada was one of the least restrictive states in the country when it came to exotic animal ownership. No formal inspection requirements, no permit process for large constrictors, and a private breeder culture that operated largely without oversight. In Nye County, where Pahrump sits, enforcement only happened when someone complained. Nobody had complained about Daniel. His largest animal was a Burmese python, approximately 15 feet long and weighing over 120 pounds. Burmese pythons are one of the largest snake species on Earth, capable of reaching 18 feet and 200 pounds in adulthood. They are not venomous. They don't need to be. Constriction works by exploiting the breathing cycle. Each time the prey exhales, the coils tighten incrementally, reducing the space available for the next inhale. A snake of this size can exert enough pressure to prevent the human chest wall from expanding at all. Death follows not from crushing, but from the inability to breathe. That distinction matters because it means the process is not fast. I think about that more than I'd like to. Daniel followed a fixed schedule for feeding and enclosure maintenance, and he handled the snake alone every single time, without restraint tools or a second person present. Care guidelines for snakes exceeding 10 feet are explicit. At minimum, 2 handlers should be present during any direct contact. A previous acquaintance had watched Daniel work with the animal on more than one occasion and quietly stopped coming around afterward. That detail sticks with me. Someone saw enough to walk away, and nothing changed. What made the morning of August 17th particularly significant was timing. The python was approaching the end of its feeding window, a period when feeding. Response behavior is measurably heightened. The animal's tongue would have been working the air constantly, picking up heat signatures and chemical traces from everything in the enclosure and beyond it. At that stage, proximity and warmth register as a single signal. The snake wasn't aggressive by nature, but biology doesn't negotiate. Daniel opened the enclosure fully to remove substrate and water containers, the same way he had done dozens of times before. The routine was so familiar that it had probably stopped feeling like a risk at all. That's the part that unsettles me most. Not recklessness, but repetition. The way familiarity quietly erodes caution until the two are indistinguishable. The python struck at close range and began constriction almost immediately, forming coils around Daniel's upper torso and neck before he could create distance. Additional loops tightened across his chest and arms, compressing the ribcage with the slow, mechanical force that makes Burmese pythons so uniquely dangerous. A heat lamp and plastic basin had been displaced inside the enclosure, evidence of a struggle that was confined and prolonged in a space that offered no room to maneuver. A nearby resident reported a single heavy impact from the direction of the garage. No further sounds followed. Daniel was found that afternoon after he missed scheduled work. The python was still partially coiled around his body when authorities arrived. Removal required control equipment and multiple responders. Death was ruled accidental, constriction during improper solo handling. The remaining reptiles on the property were seized, and the incident prompted a local review of exotic animal safety practices. By then, the only person those guidelines might have protected was already gone. It was November 7th, 2014, at a small tea plantation in the foothills outside Darjeeling, India. The plantation covered approximately 200 acres of hillside, with rows of tea bushes creating a maze-like landscape. The bushes stood about 4 feet tall, dense enough to conceal a crouching animal. Keith Lawson was 43, an agricultural specialist from Portland, hired to assess tea cultivation methods. Married with 2 children, he'd been staying at the plantation for 2 weeks. This was his first time in India, and his first experience in an area with large predators. He'd been given no specific warnings about leopards beyond a casual mention. Workers had reported livestock kills over the previous month, 3 goats and a calf taken from nearby farms. A dog had disappeared 3 days earlier, with only blood and drag marks found. The plantation manager had seen large paw prints, but assured Keith it was likely a stray dog, not wanting to alarm the foreign consultant. Local villagers had been traveling in groups after dark and keeping children inside after 5 p.m. None of this was clearly communicated to Keith. That evening, Keith left the guest house at 6:45 p.m. to walk to the main building for dinner, a routine he'd followed every evening. The walk was 400 yards along a dirt path through the tea plantation. Dusk was settling, creating deep shadows between the rows of bushes. Keith carried a flashlight but hadn't turned it on yet. He was thinking about his report and didn't notice his surroundings. Leopards typically weigh 80 to 165 pounds and are considered one of the more powerful big cats relative to their size. They are ambush predators, most active at dawn and dusk, relying on stealth and patience. When attacking, they commonly target the throat or face with powerful bites capable of fracturing bone. Keith was 200 feet from the guest house when the leopard struck from behind in complete silence. It covered 8 feet in a single leap, hitting Keith at shoulder height. His flashlight flew from his hand. He managed only a choked gasp. The leopard's claws hooked into his shoulders and upper back, driving Keith down onto his hands and knees. Its jaws clamped onto the back of his head, canines puncturing his scalp in 4 points. Keith cried out, a high-pitched, desperate sound that echoed across the plantation. The leopard adjusted its grip, biting down on the right side of his face. The canines pierced through his cheek and into his mouth. It shook its head violently, ripping his cheek open from ear to mouth. Blood poured into his mouth and down his throat. Keith rolled partially onto his back, trying to push the animal off. The leopard bit again, clamping onto his forehead and left eye. The bite force fractured the orbital bones, rupturing the eye. Keith went limp. The leopard bit down on his throat and lower face, fracturing his jaw. It tore at his right cheek, pulling back sharply. A section of tissue tore away. It bit again on his nose and upper lip, causing severe soft tissue loss. Blood filled his airway. A plantation worker 100 feet behind Keith heard his cry and began running toward the scene, making loud, aggressive sounds. The leopard heard him and grabbed Keith by the throat, beginning to drag him into the tea bushes. The worker threw a rock, striking the leopard. It released Keith and vanished into the darkness. The worker reached Keith, He was on his back, one eye destroyed, the other staring blankly. His face was unrecognizable, right cheek torn open from ear to mouth, exposing teeth and jawbone, with portions of tissue missing. Nose severely damaged, left eye socket collapsed, forehead showed deep lacerations exposing skull bone, jaw fractured and dislocated, throat showed multiple puncture wounds. Keith was still breathing, shallow, gurgling breaths, blood bubbling from his mouth. The worker alerted the plantation manager, who called for emergency response at 7:02 p.m. The nearest medical facility was approximately 40 minutes away. The manager and 3 workers carried Keith to the main building on a makeshift stretcher and tried to stop the bleeding. Keith was unconscious and unresponsive. Emergency responders arrived at 7:54 p.m., 52 minutes after the call. Keith died en route at approximately 8:17 p.m. from catastrophic craniofacial trauma, massive blood loss, shock, and airway compromise. Wildlife officials arrived the following morning and found blood evidence and drag marks leading into the tea bushes. 4 days later, they trapped a male leopard approximately 2 miles from the plantation. It was euthanized and examined. Tissue consistent with human origin was recovered from the stomach and later matched forensically to Keith. The case was ruled a wildlife-related fatality. It was September 8, 2014, and monsoon rains had turned Agusan Marsh in Mindanao's remote Agusan del Sur into a vast inland sea, pushing predators closer to homes. The stilted nipa huts sat like fragile islands, their bamboo foundations creaking under 3 feet of floodwater. Renato Dumigpe, 61, had spent his whole life on the edge of this marsh. He grew up helping his father with fish traps, then became a husband and father of 2, and, since his wife died of tuberculosis 7 years earlier, had lived alone in his single-room stilted house. Known as Tatay Ren in the barangay of 200 residents, he survived by selling tilapia and mudfish at the weekly market and growing rice during dry seasons. His daily routine rarely changed, checking fish traps at dawn, mending nets in the afternoon, and cooking simple meals over a clay stove at night. His small mongrel dog, tied to a post at the front of his house, was his only companion and his first warning against wildlife at night. Unknowingly, Renato had been feeding one of the marsh's most dangerous inhabitants by throwing fish scraps off the rear ramp. A massive saltwater crocodile had become habituated to the area directly behind his home. It blows me away that these crocodiles can grow over 14 to 17 feet and weigh more than 1,000 pounds, with enough bite force to crush large prey. The way they wait silently for hours makes them especially dangerous. Warnings had been building for days. Renato's dog barked at the rear of the house each night, which he shrugged off, while neighbors saw glowing eyes in the water and fresh slide marks along the banks. After several days of rain kept him from fishing, Renato cooked his remaining dried fish and ate near the back door, a simple bamboo panel held by a rope latch. He lay on his mat 6 feet away, unaware that rising floodwaters had turned the back ramp into a gentle slope directly connected to the marsh. When I read this, it really hits me how easy it is to not notice danger when you're used to things being a certain way. Everything seems normal until suddenly it's not, and by then, it's too late to do anything. Renato stepped onto the submerged rear ramp to rinse his hands, unaware how close the water now sat beneath him. The surface looked still until it suddenly erupted. A massive crocodile surged upward, clamping its jaws around his right thigh and knocking him off balance onto the slick bamboo. The force of the bite caused severe crushing injuries to his leg, and before he could react, the animal began a violent death roll, his body twisted with it, the ramp rattling beneath him as he tried to grab onto anything solid. He clawed at the bamboo, desperate to pull himself back, but the surface was wet and unstable. The crocodile's grip never loosened. With another powerful roll, it dragged him off the ramp and into the water. Submerged and disoriented, Renato struggled as the animal continued rolling, forcing him underwater again and again. Within seconds, his movements weakened. Within a minute of the initial strike, he lost consciousness as he was held beneath the surface. The crocodile dragged his body into the marsh, where the attack ended. Throughout it all, Renato's dog barked frantically from the front of the house, its alarm echoing across the flooded barangay. Seeing it described like this, I can't help but picture how chaotic and terrifying that moment must have been. The splashing, the sudden violence, and no way for him to get out. Neighbors were awakened by the barking and brief scream, but fear and darkness kept them from investigating. At first light, they paddled cautiously to his house, noticing disturbed water near the ramp and signs of a struggle. A clear drag trail led into the marsh, the reeds bent and broken along the path. Renato's body recovered roughly 130 feet from his home later that day. Authorities responded quickly after the local leader alerted municipal officials. A wildlife team captured the 14-foot crocodile days later and relocated it to a sanctuary. Renato's funeral was held at the small community chapel, attended by about 60 people. His children dismantled the house where he had lived, leaving the site vacant as a somber reminder of the marsh's ancient predators. Looking at this case, it doesn't feel like a single mistake led to his death. It was a combination of factors: rising water, habituated wildlife, and isolation. From my perspective, it shows how living close to nature carries risks that build quietly over time, often in ways that aren't obvious until it's too late. Even people who know the environment as well as Renato did can be caught in situations where a few small changes create a fatal outcome. It was the evening of October 3rd, 2016, in a private conservancy bordering the Masai Mara in Kenya, where the sky had turned deep orange and the savanna grass caught the last light of the day. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, the bush shifted. Animals that had rested through the afternoon heat began to move. The conservancy was the kind of place that looked, from a distance, like a postcard. Golden light, open plains, the silhouette of acacia trees against a fading sky. Madison Blake, 22, was an American Instagram model from Scottsdale, Arizona. Her account had grown steadily on the back of luxury travel content, carefully staged photographs in remote locations that made the wild look effortless and safe. She had roughly 31,000 followers and was building toward brand partnerships. Her content relied on proximity, not just beautiful landscapes, but herself inside them, close enough to make the image feel real. She had no formal wildlife training and had never been on a safari before this trip. Everything she knew about African wildlife came from what she had seen online. The version of Africa that exists on social media is curated, compressed, and stripped of consequence. It shows the golden hour and the elephant at sunrise. It does not show what moves through the grass after dark, or what happens when someone treats a wild landscape the same way they would treat a photo set. The first 2 days passed without incident. Madison photographed from the vehicle, but the results frustrated her. The animals were too far, the light too flat, the images too ordinary. By the second evening, she had begun pushing the guide, a local operator named Festus Ochieng, 46, to position the vehicle closer than standard practice allowed. Festus held firm on the core rules. No one exits the vehicle after dusk, no exceptions. I've seen this pattern before in my research, where someone with no real field experience starts treating a guide's instructions as suggestions rather than rules, and it almost always ends badly. What is worth understanding about Festus is that he was not being rigid for the sake of it. He had worked that conservancy for years. He knew what moved through the grass at dusk, and he knew that the rules he was enforcing were not arbitrary. They were written in the outcomes of situations exactly like this one. On the evening of October 3rd, the group stopped at an elevated ridge to watch the sunset. Madison wanted to frame herself against the horizon, standing outside the vehicle with the plains behind her. Festus refused. She waited until his attention shifted to another guest, then quietly stepped out, moving roughly 65 to 100 feet from the vehicle to find her angle. That distance sounds small, on open ground, at dusk, separated from the vehicle by a stretch of grass that anything could be moving through. It is not small at all. What she did not know was that a clan of spotted hyenas had been active in the area since late afternoon. A fresh kill had been reported near a watering hole less than a mile from the ridge earlier that day. Spotted hyenas are not the passive scavengers most people picture. They are highly efficient hunters, capable of sustaining speeds near 37 miles per hour over distance, with a bite force exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch, strong enough to crush bone entirely. They are most active at dusk and dawn, and they are acutely sensitive to isolated movement on open ground. What I find particularly important to understand about hyenas is that a healthy, upright adult human near a vehicle is not a target they typically pursue, but a lone figure at distance, separated from any large object, moving unpredictably in fading light, is a completely different calculation for them. The vehicle matters. The group matters. The moment Madison stepped away from both, she changed what she looked like to everything watching from the grass. Madison was focused on her phone, adjusting her position against the fading light. She did not immediately notice the first animal emerge from the grass, roughly 80 feet to her left. It stopped and watched. Then a second appeared, further to her right, also stationary. Their low whooping calls carried across the ridge. Festus heard them from the vehicle and immediately looked toward Madison. He called out. She did not hear him or did not register the urgency in his voice. She saw the animals and froze. Then she turned and ran. This is the part that I think about every time I look at this case. Spotted. Hyenas have a well-documented chase response. A fleeing target triggers pursuit instinct in a way that a stationary one simply does not. Running was the worst possible reaction, and it sealed the outcome almost instantly. The nearest animal closed the distance within seconds, bit into her left calf, and pulled her down. It released and backed off briefly, still testing, but she was no longer upright, and that changed the dynamic entirely. A standing human registers differently than a human on the ground. Once she was down, the calculation shifted again. Festus was already driving toward her, horn blaring. The second animal moved in from the right. By the time the vehicle reached her position, Madison had sustained bites to her lower legs and one hand. Festus fired a warning shot, and the animals retreated into the grass. He got her into the vehicle and drove toward the Conservancy's airstrip. Madison remained conscious for the first several minutes, then went quiet from blood, loss, and shock. The wounds to her lower legs were severe. The femoral region of her left leg had been compromised, and bleeding could not be controlled in the field. She lost consciousness before the airstrip was reached. A medical team was waiting, but could not stabilize her. She was pronounced dead approximately 40 minutes after the attack. The incident was classified as a wildlife fatality. Festus was cleared of negligence. The hyenas were not destroyed. The Conservancy issued updated safety guidelines reinforcing the prohibition on exiting vehicles after 5 p.m. Madison's body was returned to Arizona. Her social media accounts remained active for several weeks before her family quietly archived them. The final post, uploaded the morning of October 3rd, showed the Kenyan plains at sunrise with a caption about chasing golden hour. She had been chasing it that evening too. She just did not understand what else was out there, chasing alongside her. The hyenas did not pursue her because she was there. They pursued her because she ran. That distinction is the part that is hardest to sit with. It was February 9, 2014, and by mid-morning, the surface of Manque Lake sat flat under a South African summer sky, the kind of stillness that reads like calm and rarely is. Dave Hollis, 49, ran a small marine repair business out of Durban, servicing outboards and fiberglass hulls along the KwaZulu-Natal coast. Clients said that he was someone who didn't rattle when an engine seized or a hull split below the waterline. On weekends, he kayaked, not competitively, but with the quiet efficiency of someone who had logged hundreds of hours on open coastal stretches and learned to read current, wind, and weather through repetition. He had developed a habit of standing upright in his kayak to scan ahead, a technique built for rolling ocean swells where visibility mattered and balance came naturally. He was in Pilanesberg for a long weekend and had loaded the kayak into his truck bed out of habit, the same way he would have for any trip near water. Manque Lake, the reserve's largest body of water, would have looked familiar, broad, navigable, flat. To Dave, it was another stretch of open water. That framing, applied to the wrong environment, was the crux of what happened. Manque Lake sits at the center of Pilanesberg National Park, ringed by low hills that trap heat and press it flat against the water for most of the day. The lake holds a permanent population of common hippopotamus, animals averaging about 3,500 to 7,000 pounds, capable of generating jaw pressure sufficient to bisect a small watercraft and able to move through shallow water at close to 8 miles per hour with almost no surface disturbance. Hippos often give brief threat displays, but in the water, those displays can be minimal, and when they choose to defend territory, they can transition to lethal action with little time for retreat. They are intensely territorial in and around water. Posted signage at the Manque picnic site was explicit: resident hippos, no personal watercraft permitted. Precious Dlamini, 27, a park attendant on duty that morning, met Dave at the water's edge while he was unloading the kayak. She told him directly that watercraft were prohibited, that the lake had a permanent hippo population, and that the restriction existed for this specific reason. Dave told her he would stay near the edge and watch for movement. The conversation became a verbal altercation. Precious lacked the authority to physically stop him. Eventually, she returned to the picnic bench with a direct line of sight across the water. Dave launched and paddled steadily toward the center. He paused twice to stand and scan. Both times, the lake returned. Nothing. He continued forward, stood a third time, turned toward shore, and raised a hand in a brief wave at Precious. His weight shifted slightly as he settled back into the seat. The surface around him remained flat. The hippo came from directly below. The upward force was explosive, lifting and inverting the kayak in a single motion. Dave entered the water on the right side and resurfaced within seconds, arms already reaching for the kayak's edge. Precious, watching from the bench, reported hearing one shout, short and sharp, as he pulled himself partway across the hull. The hippo resurfaced alongside the kayak, less than an arm's length from where Dave lay draped over the hull. Its jaws opened wide. Adult hippos achieve a gape of nearly 150 degrees, wide enough to accommodate a human torso. The lower jaw contacted the right side of the fiberglass hull with enough force to leave deep pressure impressions. The upper jaw came down across Dave's back and left shoulder simultaneously. His grip on the kayak's edge released, and he went into the water on the far side. What followed lasted under 20 seconds. The hippo drove forward, and the surface broke into a violent, contained churn. From shore, Precious could see the orange of Dave's shirt briefly. The animal's back arched above the waterline, then both disappeared. The disturbance contracted and flattened. A single ring of disturbed water expanded outward and dissolved across the otherwise glassy surface of the lake. The kayak drifted upright within roughly a minute. The paddle remained clipped to the deck bungee cords. The hippo reappeared at intervals near the kayak over the following hour. Dave did not resurface. Precious called emergency services immediately from the bench and maintained her position, relaying updates as rangers arrived. Rangers reached the scene in approximately 16 minutes and secured the shoreline perimeter. Recovery could not begin immediately due to the animal's continued presence in the lake. Dave's body was recovered later that afternoon. Cause of death was blunt, force trauma, and crush injury consistent with large animal attack. The victim sustained catastrophic compression damage to the thoracic cavity, including multiple rib fractures on the left side and severe injury to the left lung. Lacerations consistent with large canine teeth were documented across the upper back and left shoulder. Drowning was listed as a contributing factor. Dave's kayak was recovered, floating upright near the center of the lake. The hull carried deep pressure indentations along the right side, consistent with jaw contact from a large adult hippopotamus. The paddle remained clipped to the deck. Precious Dlamini provided a full statement to rangers the same afternoon. In the days that followed, Pilanesberg issued a brief advisory reiterating the prohibition on personal watercraft at Manquis Lake. The posted signage was reviewed and confirmed to be clearly visible from the exact launch point Dave had used. The kayak was cataloged and held as part of the incident report. No policy changes were recommended. The rules had already said no. It was August 11th, 2015, and the afternoon air at Fishing Bridge Campground hung thick with the smell of charred hamburgers and pine sap. Gideon Larkins adjusted his telephoto lens, framing the massive grizzly sow as she ambled through the lodgepole pines with her two cubs trailing behind. Gideon was a 32-year-old biology teacher at a high school in Montana, known among colleagues for his unconventional teaching methods that often involved live animals and first-hand field experiences. His classroom walls were covered with photographs he had taken throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem: wolves at Lamar Valley, bull elk during the rut, and numerous close-up shots of grizzly bears. This trip to Yellowstone was his fourth that summer alone. Maris, his girlfriend of 2 years, was more reserved by nature. At 28, she worked as an elementary school librarian in Bozeman. She had learned to tolerate his risk-taking, though she kept bear spray clipped to her belt and maintained what she considered safe distances. What many visitors to Yellowstone fail to understand is the sheer power of an adult female grizzly bear. A sow protecting cubs can weigh up to 600 pounds and possesses strength capable of flipping over 200-pound boulders in search of food. Their jaws can exert over 1,200 pounds of pressure per square inch, sufficient to cause severe blunt cranial trauma. Throughout the morning, campers at Fishing Bridge had violated multiple posted regulations. Coolers sat open beside picnic tables, packages of hot dogs and marshmallows visible to anyone or anything passing through. A family from Ohio had left an entire rotisserie chicken on their table while they hiked to the nearby river. The smell of processed meat permeated the campground, despite signs every 50 yards, warning that food storage violations could result in citations and that the area had recent bear activity. At around 2 p.m., a a ranger received a radio call about a sow with cubs entering the developed area. He arrived within 10 minutes and found the roughly 550-pound bear near the campground's southern loop, her nearly 2-year-old cubs playing behind her as she sniffed the air. The ranger began hazard mitigation, shouting and using an acoustic deterrent to push them back toward the forest. About 30 tourists gathered nearby, including Gideon, who photographed the scene with his Canon. When the ranger raised his voice, Gideon lowered his camera and shouted that he was stressing the animals unnecessarily. The sow's ears flattened against her skull, a warning sign the ranger recognized immediately. She woofed, a guttural exhalation that sent her cubs scrambling up a nearby pine. The crowd fell silent. Gideon, rather than retreating, edged closer for a tighter frame, despite the ranger's shouts. Moments later, the sow covered the 30 feet between them in seconds, her bulk moving with the fluid efficiency of apex predation. Gideon barely had time to lower his camera before 550 pounds of muscle and maternal fury slammed into him, driving him backward onto the gravel. The sow's jaws closed around Gideon's head before he could scream. Gideon's body convulsed, his legs kicking against the ground as the bear shook him violently. Blood poured from where her canines had penetrated, pooling dark and fast beneath him. Maris screamed and lunged forward, grabbing at Gideon's jacket. The movement caught the sow's attention. She released Gideon's head. His skull and brain suffered severe blunt trauma and pivoted toward this new threat. Her massive paw swung in a backhanded arc, claws extended. The impact caught Maris across the neck and shoulder, lifting her briefly off her feet before she crumpled. The ranger deployed bear spray first, but when the sow kept advancing toward the crowd, he fired 4 aimed rounds because she presented an imminent threat, dropping her 12 feet from Gideon's body. Multiple campers had already dialed 911. Additional rangers and emergency medical personnel arrived at 2:30 p.m., but the scene they found required no medical intervention. Gideon had died rapidly from severe blunt cranial trauma and cervical injury. Maris suffered severe blunt cervical trauma. Death resulted from spinal cord injury. The sow, still breathing when additional rangers arrived, was euthanized with a final shot. Her 2 cubs, stranded in the pine tree, were tranquilized and transported to a wildlife holding facility in Bozeman, where they would eventually be relocated to a sanctuary in Montana. Fishing Bridge Campground was closed for 3 days while investigators reconstructed the attack, and wildlife officials assessed whether other bears in the area had become habituated to human food. The investigation concluded that improper food storage had drawn the sow into the developed area, and that Gideon's aggressive approach had triggered her defensive response. No charges were filed. It was April 22, 2017, and the oppressive heat of the Australian wet season hung over the remote waterways of the Northern Territory, where the muddy brown water moved slowly between mangrove-lined banks that concealed one of nature's most patient predators. Warning signs in multiple languages dotted the shoreline, their sun-faded text describing recent crocodile attacks and the futility of swimming in these waters. Ben Crawford was a 30-year-old personal trainer from Sydney whose social media presence was built around extreme fitness challenges and death-defying stunts. His YouTube channel had gained a modest following through videos of him performing dangerous workouts in precarious locations, a brand identity that required him to continuously escalate. Friends described him as someone who dismissed safety advice as cowardice, disguised as wisdom, which is a very specific worldview to hold when you are planning to swim in a river full of large reptiles. Ben had driven 12 hours from Darwin specifically to film content at this remote river system, drawn by online reports of large crocodile populations and the area's reputation as one of Australia's most dangerous waterways. He had researched the location obsessively, not for safety information, but for the most dramatic angles and the highest likelihood of crocodile encounters. He got exactly what he came for. Local Aboriginal guides at a nearby fishing camp had warned Ben about the river's reputation when he stopped for directions. They explained that the waterway was home to numerous saltwater crocodiles, including several large males responsible for multiple attacks on livestock and at least 2 human fatalities in recent years. Ben thanked them for the information while privately dismissing their concerns as exaggerated local folklore designed to keep tourists away from prime fishing spots. The guides, who had lived alongside this river their entire lives, were presumably unaware of how much Ben knew about it after a few hours of online research. The riverbend Ben had selected was particularly notorious among locals. The deep pool was marked by slide marks on the muddy banks and the complete absence of water birds that typically populated similar areas. Two details that, to anyone paying attention, communicated something important about the local food chain. Ben waded into the shallows, planning to swim across the 50-foot wide channel. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptiles, with mature males commonly exceeding 16 feet in length and weighing over 1,000 pounds. They are ambush predators of extraordinary patience, capable of remaining motionless for hours while monitoring potential prey. Their bite force is among the most powerful in the animal kingdom, measuring over 3,700 pounds per square inch, strong enough to crush a water buffalo's skull. Ben had waded approximately 15 feet from shore when the water erupted around him. A saltwater crocodile, estimated at 14 to 16 feet in length, launched itself from the muddy bottom with explosive force. The animal's jaws, open to 75 degrees, clamped down on Ben's right leg, just above the knee. The initial bite fractured his femur, the crushing pressure collapsing bone and muscle beneath jaws designed to overpower large prey. The crocodile immediately initiated its death roll, spinning through the murky water with Ben trapped in its jaws. The violent rotation disoriented Ben completely, his world becoming a chaos of brown water, pain, and the crushing pressure around his leg. Each revolution tore muscle and ligament, the crocodile's teeth grinding against bone and tissue. Ben's attempts to surface for air were futile as the death roll continued, the crocodile's massive weight and momentum keeping him submerged. The spinning motion caused massive internal damage as his body was whipped through the water. Blood dispersed through the current in a way that could have drawn the attention of other crocodiles nearby. After what seemed like an eternity, but lasted perhaps 30 seconds, the crocodile released its grip and repositioned, clamping down on Ben's torso just below his ribcage. The second bite punctured his lung and crushed several ribs, the massive teeth penetrating deep into his chest cavity. Ben's scream was cut short as water filled his punctured lung, his body going into shock from blood loss and trauma. The crocodile began dragging Ben into deeper water. Crocodiles typically drown large prey before consuming it, often dragging carcasses into submerged areas where they may be cached. Ben's consciousness faded as his body was pulled beneath the surface, and the water gradually returned to its deceptively calm state. A search and rescue operation was launched when Ben failed to return to his accommodation that evening. His abandoned vehicle was found at the river access point. Ben's body was never recovered, despite extensive searching of the river system. The Northern Territory government used the incident to reinforce warnings about crocodile-infested waterways, though officials noted that Ben had ignored multiple posted warnings and had deliberately entered water known to be extremely dangerous. Additional signage was installed. It joined the signs that had already been there, which Ben had also ignored. His YouTube channel was deleted by his family shortly after his death. It was March 22nd, 2016, at a small private animal sanctuary in rural Georgia, about 40 miles outside of Macon. The sanctuary consisted of a main house, several outbuildings, and 3 animal enclosures spread across 12 acres of wooded property. Carol Mendez was 41, a dental hygienist who volunteered on weekends as a caretaker for the sanctuary's single chimpanzee. She'd worked with the chimp for 6 months. Divorced with 2 teenage children, she'd always loved animals, but had no formal training with primates. The sanctuary owners, a retired couple in their late 60s, had assured her the chimp was gentle and socialized, giving her no formal training, just verbal instructions on feeding and cleaning. The sanctuary operated in a legal gray area. Their permits had expired 18 months earlier, but enforcement was lax, and the owners had avoided scrutiny by keeping a low profile. The chimp had shown signs of agitation in recent weeks, pacing for hours, refusing food, making aggressive displays when male visitors approached. A veterinarian who'd examined him 3 weeks earlier had recommended a behavioral evaluation and possible relocation. The owners couldn't afford it and didn't follow up. They mentioned to Carol that he seemed off lately, but assured her he'd never hurt anyone. That morning, Carol arrived wearing new perfume and a bright yellow jacket, both unusual. The chimp stared at her through the fence for 20 minutes, unusually still and focused. Carol noticed, but interpreted it as interest or affection. Adult male chimpanzees weigh 100 to 130 pounds, but are significantly stronger pound for pound than humans, with explosive upper body power disproportionate to their size. They have canine teeth over an inch long, and bite force estimated around 1,000 psi, enough to fracture bone and tear through muscle. In attacks, chimpanzees instinctively target faces, hands, and genitals, biting repeatedly and tearing away tissue. When Carol approached the enclosure gate, the chimp moved to the far corner and sat facing away, unusual, as he normally rushed to the gate when food arrived. Carol assumed he was sulking. She entered through a gate secured by a simple hook and eye latch, placed the food bowl near the center, and turned to leave, her back to the chimp. The chimp moved instantly, covering 15 feet in under 2 seconds. Carol heard knuckles and feet pounding concrete and started to turn. He leaped onto her back before she could face him, his 115-pound weight driving her forward. Carol stumbled, but didn't fall. She screamed. The chimp's first bite targeted the right side of her face, canines piercing through her ear and cheek. He bit down with full force, then pulled back sharply. The ear tore away, along with a large section of cheek. She fell forward onto her hands and knees. His second bite clamped onto her nose and upper lip. He shook his head violently and tore through both, causing extensive soft tissue loss. Carol reached back blindly with her right hand. The chimp grabbed it and bit down on 3 fingers. The bones fractured audibly, and he severed the middle finger at the second knuckle. He bit her face again, left cheek, then forehead, then left eye. The eye socket collapsed under repeated trauma. Blood ran down her face. The sanctuary owners were in the main house 80 yards away. They heard Carol's scream and ran outside. By the time they reached the enclosure, approximately 60 to 90 seconds after the attack began, Carol was face down and motionless. The chimp crouched over her, biting the back of her head. The male owner grabbed a metal pole, entered the enclosure, and struck the chimp twice. After a third blow to the shoulder, the chimp retreated to the far corner. The owners dragged Carol out. Her face was destroyed, right ear missing, nose gone. Only a ragged wound remained. Upper lip torn away, exposing teeth and gums. Left cheek had a large section missing, exposing molars and jawbone. Left eye socket crushed, eye ruptured, jaw fractured with partial dislocation. 3 fingers on her right hand mangled, 1 completely severed. Emergency services were called at 3:18 p.m. An ambulance arrived 22 minutes later, stabilized Carol, and transported her to a regional facility, before airlift to a trauma center. Carol died 4 hours later, at 7:43 p.m., from blood loss and shock. The facial damage was too extensive to stabilize. She'd also developed acute respiratory distress from aspirating blood during the attack, and airway compromise made it impossible to maintain adequate oxygen levels despite intubation attempts. The chimp was euthanized that evening. Necropsy revealed partially digested tissue, consistent with facial tissue in his stomach. The owners were investigated for operating without proper permits and for negligence. No criminal charges were filed, but they were prohibited from keeping exotic animals. The case was ruled a death by misadventure. It was October 7, 2014, when humid air of Sumatra's lowland rainforest hung heavy beneath a dense canopy. The remote forest region in Indonesia represented a transitional zone between secondary growth and protected primary forest. A small trekking company operated guided walks through the area. David Monroe, a 29-year-old adventure travel blogger from Portland, had joined a 3-day jungle trek with 2 other tourists, a British couple on their honeymoon. The group was led by a local guide named Booty, who had been leading treks for approximately 7 years. David had spent 8 months traveling through Southeast Asia, documenting off-trail experiences for his blog and YouTube channel. Unlike Jennifer, David was self-taught and often exaggerated his expertise for his audience. The trek had been uneventful for the first 2 days. Booty provided basic information about the forest. He mentioned Sumatran tigers inhabited the region, but emphasized they were rarely seen. Booty had seen tiger tracks, but never encountered a tiger itself. The morning of October 7th found the group navigating a section where human traffic was minimal. The trail was a game trail, roughly 2 feet wide. Vegetation was dense on both sides, with visibility limited to approximately 15 to 20 feet. David had fallen behind the main group by roughly 60 feet. He frequently stopped to film segments for his vlog. Booty had expressed concern about this pattern, asking David to stay closer, but David assured him he would catch up. The separation meant David was often alone on the trail for periods of 3 to 5 minutes. At approximately 11:20 a.m., David stopped again to film. He positioned his camera on the trail and recorded himself talking about jungle sounds. The other group members were now approximately 100 feet ahead and out of sight beyond a bend. An adult female Sumatran tiger, estimated at 7 feet in length and weighing approximately 220 pounds, had been resting in dense cover roughly 40 feet off the trail. The tiger had detected the group's approach minutes earlier and had moved into concealment, watching them pass. David's solo presence, separated from the group, triggered a different behavioral response. Tigers are more likely to view solitary humans as potential prey. Sumatran tigers are the smallest surviving tiger subspecies, with adult females weighing 165 to 250 pounds. Despite their smaller size, they remain apex predators perfectly adapted for hunting in dense jungle. Their striped coat provides exceptional camouflage. They are ambush predators, approaching silently before explosive attacks. The tiger moved silently through undergrowth, positioning herself roughly 25 feet from where David stood. She approached from behind and to his left, moving with absolute silence. Her padded paws made no sound. David finished recording and turned to pack up his camera. As he bent down to collapse his tripod, the tiger launched her attack. She covered the final 12 feet in a single explosive leap, her 220 pounds airborne, before striking David from behind. The tiger's front paws struck David's upper back and shoulders, knocking him forward onto the ground. Her claws penetrated deep into shoulder and back muscle. The momentum drove David face first into the trail, and the tiger's weight forced all air from his lungs. The tiger immediately secured a killing bite on David's throat, not the back of his neck. She repositioned her jaws around the front of his neck, clamping down on his trachea and carotid arteries. This throat bite is the typical killing method for tigers attacking human-sized prey. It causes rapid suffocation and unconsciousness through carotid compression. Her canine teeth crushed his trachea and severed the jugular vein. Within seconds, David's brain began starving for oxygen. The combination caused rapid loss of consciousness within approximately 15 to 20 seconds. His body went limp. The official cause of death was suffocation combined with exsanguination from neck wounds. The tiger maintained her throat bite for approximately 45 seconds after David stopped moving. She then released and stood over his body. After roughly 2 minutes, the tiger seized David's body by the shoulder and dragged it off the trail into dense undergrowth, moving approximately 45 feet and positioning it beneath ferns. Booty and the British couple realized David was missing approximately 8 minutes after the attack. They backtracked, calling his name. They found David's camera and tripod set up with drag marks visible. Booty immediately recognized signs of a tiger attack and ordered the group to retreat. They hiked back to the nearest village and alerted authority. A search team reached the location by late afternoon, approximately 4 hours after the attack. They located David's body approximately 30 feet from where the search had been suspended. The tiger had begun feeding, focusing on thighs and buttocks. Approximately 8 to 12 pounds of tissue had been consumed. In the wake of the tragedy, Indonesian conservation officials initiated a formal response within 24 hours. A joint team from regional wildlife authorities and park rangers was deployed to the site the following morning. The area was immediately closed to trekking activity. The attack was classified as a confirmed fatal tiger incident based on wound patterns, drag marks, and feeding behavior. Authorities installed camera traps along game trails within a 1-mile radius and conducted track analysis to identify the individual responsible. Pug marks consistent with an adult female were documented near the drag site and along a nearby stream corridor. Over the next 5 days, tracking teams attempted to relocate the tiger. Motion-triggered cameras captured images of a single adult female returning to the vicinity of the attack site on 2 separate nights. Based on stripe pattern analysis, officials confirmed it was the same tiger responsible for the attack. Because the incident involved clear predatory behavior rather than defensive contact, wildlife authorities authorized a capture operation. Baited cage traps were installed along known travel corridors. After 8 days of monitoring, the tiger did not enter the traps. Authorities concluded that the tiger had not demonstrated repeated aggression toward humans, and that trekking activity in the region posed the greater risk. The forest zone remained closed for 6 weeks. Local villages were formally notified, and patrol presence was increased. Booty's guiding license was suspended for 1 year, pending investigation into failure to maintain group cohesion. It was the early morning of February 11, 2014, in a private conservancy in the Laikipia Plateau of central Kenya, where rocky outcrops broke the scrubland and fever trees lined dry riverbeds. The light was low and flat, ideal for photography. The Laikipia is quieter than the Mara, less trafficked, and the animals there move through the landscape with a kind of self-possession that is different from what you see in heavily visited reserves. Elena Petrova, 36, was a Russian wildlife photographer based in Nairobi. She had lived in Kenya for 4 years, working on a long-term personal project, documenting predator behavior in private conservancies. She was technically skilled and deeply familiar with the landscape, and she had photographed leopards on multiple occasions. Her guide was a local tracker named Mwenda Kariuki, 40, who had worked the Laikipia Conservancy for 8 years. Mwenda had noted Elena's tendency to push slightly beyond recommended positions, always seeking a cleaner angle or a less obstructed frame. Elena was not reckless in the way that Madison or Thomas were reckless. She had real knowledge, real experience, and a genuine understanding of the animals she was photographing. She had simply reached a point where her own judgment felt more reliable than the boundary she was being asked to stay within. The group had located a female leopard resting on a low granite outcrop, roughly 200 feet from the vehicle. Elena photographed from the vehicle for several minutes, then pushed to move to a position beside a large rock formation to the left for a direct sightline. Mwenda refused. Elena waited, then moved anyway, during a moment when Mwenda was speaking to another guest. Leopards are ambush predators that can shift from calm to a full attack in under a second, covering ground faster than most people can process. They are solitary, territorial, and highly sensitive to anything that enters their space from an unexpected angle. What made Elena's position particularly dangerous was not just the distance she had closed, it was that she had moved to a point that cut off the leopard's most direct escape route from the outcrop. A leopard that feels cornered does not wait. Elena crouched and adjusted her lens. Mwenda saw the leopard's posture change, ears flattening, body lowering, and called out sharply. Elena began to stand. The leopard came off the rock fast. It struck Elena across the face and left shoulder, driving her into the rock face. She was on the ground but conscious, trying to cover her face with her arms. The leopard bit into her left shoulder and upper neck, then released when Mwenda fired a warning shot. It did not go far. It retreated roughly 20 feet and crouched low in the scrub, watching. As Mwenda reached Elena and began pulling her upright, the leopard rose and took several steps forward. Mwenda fired a second warning shot directly in front of it. The animal stopped, held its position for a moment, then turned and moved into the brush at a slow, deliberate pace, not fleeing, just withdrawing. That detail has always stayed with me. It did not run, it left on its own terms. The wound to Elena's upper neck was deep and bleeding heavily. Mwenda applied pressure and drove back toward the Conservancy's base camp. She remained conscious for most of the drive, then lost consciousness in the final minutes. She died before a medical evacuation could be arranged. Blood loss from lacerations to the neck and shoulder. The attack had been defensive, not predatory, but the injuries were in a location where field intervention was not enough. Mwenda had done everything correctly from the moment the leopard moved. None of it was enough, because the wound was in a place where the margin between survivable and fatal was measured in minutes, and the nearest medical facility was too far away. The incident was classified as a wildlife fatality. Mwenda was cleared of negligence. The leopard was not destroyed. Elena's camera was recovered intact, the last frame showing the leopard on the outcrop, calm and still, minutes before the attack. Her body was repatriated to Russia. She had spent 4 years in Kenya, building a body of work about predator behavior. The one thing she had not fully accounted for was the specific geometry of where she was standing, and that single miscalculation was the one that mattered. It was March 3rd, 2015, and the Crocodile River at the southern boundary of Kruger National Park moved in a steady pull. Derek Azian had parked near the Crocodile Bridge rest stop with his 16-year-old daughter, Lila. Derek was 44, a refrigeration technician from Johannesburg who spent his working life diagnosing pressure systems and repairing industrial cooling units across the Gauteng region. Close friends said that he had framed the Kruger trip as an educational detour before Lila's school term resumed. Something practical, something she could remember. He had visited game parks before, never with a guide, and carried that history as quiet evidence that he understood outdoor environments. He carried an empty 32-ounce plastic bottle down toward the water's edge, telling Lila, according to her later statement to rangers, that the current was moving too fast for anything to hold position near the bank. It was sound reasoning for a pressurized pipe. It was fatal reasoning for a river on the southern boundary of one of Africa's most crocodile-dense ecosystems. Nile crocodiles in this section of the park reach up to 16 to 18 feet in length and can exceed 1,500 pounds. Their ambush technique requires no surface movement. They position beneath the bank shelf, completely motionless, detecting vibration and shadow from below. A strike can cover several feet in a fraction of a second. Their bite force measures approximately 5,000 pounds per square inch, with some measurements reporting similar values. And the death roll, their rotational maneuver following the initial grab, is designed to disorient and drown prey before injury becomes the primary cause of death. On the far bank, Ranger Solomon Maseko was conducting a routine patrol when he observed Derek moving down the slope toward the waterline. He recognized the posture immediately and shouted across, "Step back, move away from the edge." Derek raised one hand in acknowledgement without turning his head or adjusting his direction. Maseko called again. Derek crouched at the water's edge, placed one foot on a dark, wet rock, and extended the bottle toward the current. Derek leaned forward to submerge it fully. The current created slight drag on the bottle, and the bottle pulled against his grip, forcing him to lean farther to compensate. He was mid-crouch, weight distributed forward, when the crocodile came from directly beneath the bank shelf. Maseko had no way to cross the river. He had done everything available to him. What Maseko described in his incident report was a single upward snap. No visible surface approach, no warning movement, followed by the sharp break of water and Derek being pulled forward at the waist. The bottle left his hand immediately. His upper body was below the surface within 2 seconds of initial contact. His legs struck the flat rock once, audibly, before being dragged fully into the river. Lila's scream carried across the water as Maseko reached for his radio. The death roll began almost immediately. Maseko observed a tight rotation of disturbed water and suspended silt lasting under 30 seconds before the surface settled. A 1,500-pound animal rolling at full torque generates immense rotational force, capable of fracturing joints and tearing connective tissue rapidly. The chest compresses, blood flow to the brain stops, and the lungs fill. Derek showed none of the prolonged surface struggle that shallow water attacks sometimes produce. The river flattened completely and went still. The plastic bottle continued downstream, rotating slowly in the current, and was recovered by rangers approximately 200 yards from the point of entry. Maseko radioed the incident at 5:41 p.m. while maintaining visuals on the area. Lila remained near the vehicle and reached emergency services on her phone after obtaining a signal. Rangers arrived on Derek's side of the bank within approximately 10 to 20 minutes. A recovery team was mobilized and worked downstream sections through the evening. His body was located hours later in a reed bed, roughly a mile from where he had entered the water, partially submerged. The formal coroner summary noted blunt force compression injuries consistent with large reptile trauma. Time of death was estimated within 3 to 5 minutes of initial contact. Lila was taken into the care of relatives that evening and returned to Johannesburg the following morning. No public statement was made by the family. The internal park report contained a single line under circumstances. Guest exited vehicle and approached waterline despite verbal warning. The Crocodile Bridge rest stop remained open. Warning signs were already posted at the entry point and along the slope leading to the bank. The river continued at the same steady pull it had maintained all afternoon, indifferent and unchanged. It was March 15, 2017, and the heavy pre-monsoon heat settled over the kampong houses outside Temerloh. The night air was still, and beyond the wooden walls, a large animal moved quietly through the brush, drawn by the presence of small prey and nearby human activity. Faisal bin Osman, 28, had moved into the small wooden house 2 years earlier after his workshop closed. Quiet and slight, he spent his days repairing bikes in a shed beside the house and lived mostly alone, calling his parents only once a month. The modest 1980s home had thin wooden walls, a simple layout, and small gaps beneath the doors and along the base, common in the area, but not always secure against wildlife. Unbeknownst to him, a large reticulated python had been frequenting the area, feeding on rodents and poultry around nearby homes. Over the months, warning signs had quietly accumulated. Faisal often heard rustling and scraping sounds outside at night, sometimes close to the walls. A faint track in the dirt near his doorway appeared one morning, but went unnoticed. By February, a musky odor had begun to linger near the back of the house. Faisal assumed it came from damp wood or a dead animal nearby and tried to ignore it. In the days before the incident, neighbors reported seeing a large snake moving near the edge of the settlement, likely following rodents and chickens. The pre-monsoon heat and limited prey pushed it closer to human structures. That night, Faisal lay on his thin mattress on the floor, the wooden door shut but not fully sealed, leaving a gap. Into the night, the python entered through that gap. Faisal was asleep when the snake moved across the floor and made contact. He woke suddenly, confused, and tried to pull away, but the python struck and anchored onto his upper arm and shoulder area. Almost instantly, its body snapped into coils around him. Faisal struggled instinctively, pushing against the dense, muscular coils, but the snake tightened with controlled, steady force. Its coils wrapped rapidly around his chest, torso, and legs, pinning his arm against his ribs almost immediately. The pressure compressed his chest and major blood vessels, disrupting circulation almost immediately. He managed one full, panicked scream, followed by shorter, strained cries that echoed in the small room. Panic surged as he realized he couldn't free himself. The python tightened rapidly, locking its coils in place and applying crushing pressure within seconds. His movements weakened as circulation was disrupted. His vision blurred, and he lost consciousness soon after as his blood pressure collapsed under the sustained constriction. Even after he was still, the python remained coiled tightly, instinctively maintaining its hold. Its body stayed wrapped around him, unmoving except for subtle tightening, acting purely on instinct rather than intent. His neighbor, Enchik Hafiz, was awakened by the distant screams. He instructed his wife to stay inside, grabbed a flashlight, and cautiously approached Faisal's house, his pace slowing as the silence returned. Finding no response at the door, he stepped inside and immediately saw the scene: the disturbed room and the massive python coiled tightly around Faisal's motionless body. Shaken, he backed out and called emergency services. When responders arrived, they faced the difficult task of safely restraining and uncoiling the snake, which took over 20 minutes. Faisal was pronounced dead at the scene, and the python was captured and relocated to a nearby wildlife reserve. His devastated parents traveled from Terengganu for the funeral, attended by 25 family members. The house remained vacant for over a year before it was eventually demolished, a quiet reminder of what had happened inside. It was July 18th, 2015, in a remote camping area near the Appalachian Trail in western North Carolina. Dense forest surrounded the campsite, with berry bushes heavy with fruit. Visibility through the trees was limited to about 30 feet. The ground was soft from recent rain, showing tracks clearly. Roger Finch was 34 years old, an off-duty park ranger from a neighboring district. He'd been camping alone for 3 days, documenting black bear behavior during berry season for a wildlife awareness project. Roger had 8 years of experience as a ranger, but had grown comfortable around the local bear population. Despite his professional training, he'd become casual about his own safety protocols. He'd encountered black bears dozens of times without incident, and believed his experience made him accepted by the local bears. Rangers had posted warnings about a female bear with cubs showing aggressive behavior. She'd bluff charged 2 hikers 4 days earlier. Roger had seen her twice from a distance and believed she was used to him. He'd even named her Bella in his field notes. That morning, Roger found fresh claw marks on trees near his camp, higher and deeper than before. Berry bushes around his tent had been stripped overnight. Warm scat lay 20 feet from his tent. His camp stove had been knocked over while he slept. The bear was getting bolder, but Roger rationalized each sign, telling himself she was just following her normal feeding pattern. Adult female black bears weigh 150 to 250 pounds, but can run 30 miles per hour and climb trees easily. Normally shy, females with cubs are highly protective and account for most serious attacks. When defending cubs, they target the face and head, with bite force estimated between 600 and 700 psi and 2-inch claws designed for tearing flesh. Roger crouched 40 feet from his tent, changing a camera lens with his back to the forest. His bear spray sat clipped to his backpack. 6 feet away, he heard branches snap. Turning, he saw the female bear emerge with 2 cubs behind her. He'd positioned himself directly between the mother and her young. The cubs were on the far side of his tent. The bear's ears flattened, her lips pulled back. No warning grunt. She charged, covering 40 feet in under 3 seconds. Roger raised his arms and shouted. She didn't stop. At 15 feet, he turned to run. The worst response. At 5 feet, he tried to drop into fetal position. Too late. The 220-pound bear slammed into his chest, driving the air from his lungs. Her first swipe tore 4 parallel gashes from temple to jaw, snapping his head sideways. The second strike hooked into his scalp, peeling back a flap of skin over his left eye. Roger covered his face with his arms. The bear bit down on his right forearm, canines puncturing to bone, and shook violently, dragging him 6 feet across the ground. When his arms stopped moving, she focused on his face. Her jaws clamped onto his skull. His cheekbone cracked. She tore at his face with her teeth, ripping away tissue from his left cheek, then tore through his nose and upper lip, partially avulsing both. The attack continued for approximately 30 seconds before the bear heard hikers approaching. She retreated with her cubs as the sounds grew closer. 2 hikers, 200 yards away, had heard thrashing and disturbing sounds. They approached cautiously, making noise. By the time they reached the clearing, the bear had vanished. Roger lay unconscious, face unrecognizable. The left side was destroyed, cheek gone, exposing teeth and jawbone. Left eye socket crushed, eye ruptured, nose and upper lip partially avulsed. Deep lacerations exposed skull bone. His right forearm showed compound fractures, bone visible through torn flesh. Significant blood loss had pooled beneath him. The male hiker had minimal cell service and called for emergency response at 9:47 a.m., while his wife applied pressure to Roger's wounds using their spare clothing. The nearest road accessible by ambulance was a 45-minute hike away. A medical helicopter was dispatched, but took 38 minutes to arrive due to weather conditions. Paramedics reached Roger at 10:52 a.m., 65 minutes after the attack. Roger died during the helicopter flight at approximately 11:20 a.m. Multiple skull fractures with intracranial hemorrhage and airway compromise proved incompatible with survival. When the bear was tracked and euthanized 2 days later, examination revealed steinert trace amounts of human tissue, consistent with incidental ingestion during the attack. The case was ruled an accidental death caused by wildlife encounter. It was August 14th, 2016, and the dry season had reduced the Amboseli Basin to cracked earth and yellowed scrub. Kilimanjaro floated above the haze like something painted rather than real, beautiful enough to make a person lower their guard, which is exactly what happened. Rod Stanton, 54, had spent 31 years in municipal road maintenance. He had color-coded planners, laminated hazard cards in his work truck, a man who understood better than most that ignoring warning signs costs lives. He had semi-retired 8 months before the trip, but still consulted 2 days a week. His wife Cheryl, 51, worked part-time at a dental clinic front desk and had taken up wildlife photography 2 years prior. Wall calendars, local competitions, a regional honorable mention. Africa had been her idea. Rod had planned every detail of it, but he had begun deferring to her framing choices when they stopped for photos, letting her step out briefly on earlier stops without incident. They flew into Nairobi, rented a mid-size SUV, and entered Amboseli that morning with a printed guidebook Rod had annotated in red pen. He had flagged several sections, including a red-bordered warning box on solitary bull elephants, unpredictable behavior, tendency toward aggression, approach distance not less than 100 feet. The page was open on the dashboard when they stopped. A vehicle operated by their guide, Daniel Kibet, 32, had been trailing the Stantons for roughly 20 minutes. He had watched their pattern. Frequent stops, doors opening, Cheryl stepping out to clear her frame. At 10:38 a.m., the Stantons braked approximately 100 feet from a lone bull elephant feeding head down in low scrub, having slowed for a clearer view across the open ground despite the lack of cover or escape route. African bush elephants are the largest land animals on Earth, with mature bulls reaching up to around 13 feet at the shoulder and weighing several tons. A full charge can cover roughly 100 feet in a few seconds. Bull elephants traveling alone cycle through must, a hormonal surge that significantly elevates aggression. In must, a bull charges with minimal provocation, and the charge is rarely a bluff. Kibet sounded his horn once and accelerated forward, angling his vehicle slightly toward theirs to close distance and discourage them from exiting. Both SUV doors opened within seconds of the vehicle stopping. Kibet sounded again, then leaned from his window and shouted for them to get back inside. He watched Cheryl step away from the vehicle to clear a thorn bush from her shot. The bull raised its head, its ears spread wide, then folded flat against its skull. The shift guides recognize it as the transition from alert to threat. It turned fully toward them and took 2 deliberate steps forward, head low, weight shifting. Keebit held his horn down and advanced a few more feet with his vehicle in an attempt to draw the bull's attention and create a buffer, warning them for the 3rd time. Rod reached for Cheryl's arm, and for a moment they were close. Then they separated, Rod angling back toward the driver's door, Cheryl drifting right, still holding her phone, stepping backward across uneven ground while watching her screen. The bull broke. It covered the distance to Cheryl in a few seconds. Keebit described the first impact as a single unbroken forward surge, the elephant's head striking her at chest height and driving her straight down into the dirt. She didn't stumble. She went down as though the ground had been pulled out from under her. The first forefoot came down across her midsection. The second followed within a single stride. Dust rose from both contact points. Cheryl did not move after the first impact. The bull pivoted. Rod had reached the driver's door and was pulling the handle. It didn't open. The vehicle had been locked with the key fob when they stepped out, and in the confusion, he fumbled the fob and dropped it into the dirt beside the front tire. He looked down briefly, then moved along the side of the SUV toward the rear without retrieving it. The rear door came open halfway. The elephant reached him before he cleared the frame. Keebit reported the bull struck with its forehead first, driving Rod against the door jamb and forcing him down to the ground beside the rear wheel. The door folded inward. The bull shifted its weight over him for 3 to 4 seconds, Keebit's estimate, then stepped back, swung its head once at the vehicle body, and walked away at a steady pace into the scrub. Keebit radioed park control at 10:45 a.m. after maintaining position in his vehicle and keeping the horn engaged until the bull had moved a safe distance away. He approached in his vehicle first, stopping short, then stepping out only after confirming the bull had continued into the scrub and was no longer oriented toward the scene after roughly 25 seconds of stillness. The first ranger unit arrived at 11:03 a.m., delayed by distance from the nearest patrol route across the floodplain tracks. Both victims were declared deceased on site. Cheryl Stanton died of crush trauma to the chest and abdomen. Rod died of blunt force and compression injuries to the thorax and skull, consistent with being pinned beneath a large animal. The Kenya Wildlife Service logged the incident as a visitor conduct fatality. Keebit's account was accepted without dispute. No disciplinary action was taken against park staff. It was the afternoon of March 17, 2015, in a remote sector of the Selous Game Reserve in southern Tanzania, where flat acacia woodland stretched in every direction and the midday heat had pushed most animals into shade. A pride of lions had settled near a dry stream bed, barely visible through the low brush. The Selous is one of the largest protected areas in Africa, vast, remote, and largely unchanged. Thomas Reed, 50, was a semi-retired American investor from Denver, Colorado. He was physically fit, well-traveled, and accustomed to being the most capable person in any room. He had been on 2 previous safaris in southern Africa and considered himself experienced. He had a habit of second-guessing guides on minor decisions, and from what I've seen in cases like this, that kind of confidence is often the most dangerous thing a person can bring into the bush. Experience in one context does not transfer cleanly to another. 2 safaris from inside a vehicle is not the same as understanding what it means to be on foot in lion territory, and the gap between those 2 things is where Thomas Reed's story lives. His guide was a local operator named Dio Mwangi, 38, who had worked the Selous for 11 years. The group had been watching the pride for approximately 20 minutes. The lions appeared relaxed, several were sleeping, one was grooming, and a large male was lying flat with his eyes half closed. Thomas pushed repeatedly to step out for a lower angle, arguing that the lions were too settled to react. Deo refused each time. He knew that a resting lion and a safe lion are not the same thing, and he knew that the distance between the vehicle and the pride was not a buffer, it was a margin, and margins disappear fast. Thomas waited. African lions are not passive animals in the presence of humans on foot, and this is something I think people consistently underestimate. A pride in a resting state can shift to full aggression in under 2 seconds when a perceived threat enters their space. male lions are territorial and will charge to defend proximity to the pride. When Deo stepped briefly to the rear of the vehicle to retrieve a water container, Thomas opened the door on the far side and stepped out. He moved roughly 50 feet from the vehicle, crouching to frame his shot. The large male detected the movement. Its head lifted, its body shifted. Deo later estimated the charge began almost instantly after Thomas crouched. Crouching changes the silhouette, lowers the profile, and in the context of predator-prey dynamics, it can register as a signal that something is vulnerable. Thomas was trying to get a better angle. The lion was reading something else entirely. The lion struck Thomas from the side, driving him into the ground with its full weight. Thomas managed to get an arm up, and the first bite caught his forearm and shoulder rather than his throat. He was pinned, but conscious. Still struggling, the lion shifted its grip to the back of his neck and upper back. Deo grabbed his rifle and fired a warning shot. The lion hesitated due to noise, not fear. It stepped back roughly 15 feet and stood there, watching, tail moving slowly. Deo fired a second shot into the ground between them. The lion flinched, turned, and walked back toward the stream bed at a slow pace, stopping once to look back before disappearing into the brush. I've read accounts of lions behaving exactly this way after a warning shot. They disengage, but they don't flee. And that moment where the animal is still deciding is one of the most dangerous parts of the entire encounter. Deo and another guest pulled Thomas to the vehicle. He was conscious and speaking in fragments. He was transported to the nearest airstrip and transferred to a private medical facility. He survived the night but deteriorated through the following morning, dying approximately 18 hours after the attack from internal hemorrhage and spinal trauma. The lion had not needed long to do damage that could not be undone. The incident was classified as a wildlife fatality resulting from unauthorized exit of a safari vehicle. Deo was cleared of all responsibility. The lions were not harmed. Thomas's body was repatriated to Colorado. It was November 12, 2015, and a cold wind swept across a small farm at the edge of a forest in northern India. The quiet was broken only by rustling leaves and the low sounds of cattle moving in their pens. A young leopard had been observing the property for days, learning human routines and waiting for an opportunity. Kamla Devi, 67, had managed the farm for decades alongside her late husband. 3 years after his death, she continued the work alone despite stiffening arthritis. Tasks that once came easily, securing gates, tending livestock, repairing fences, had become slower and more difficult, leaving small vulnerabilities around the property. Neighbors had reported seeing the leopard moving along the forest edge in recent weeks. Strong and agile, it appeared to be hunting as natural prey became scarce with winter approaching. Leopards sometimes approach farms where human settlements meet dense forest, usually avoiding direct contact with people. Still, repeated sightings near livestock suggested this particular animal had grown bolder, testing boundaries and assessing risk. Ravi Kumar, a 19-year-old seasonal helper, had recommended reinforcing fencing and keeping watch at night. Kamla, however, postponed changes, planning to act after winter. That evening, after feeding the cattle, she made her way slowly toward the kitchen, the wind pressing against her back and shadows stretching across the yard. The leopard, already near the barn under low light and dense shrubs, seized its chance. Its movements were precise, honed by days of observation. From its concealed position, it lunged with surprising speed. Kamla had only a moment to react, raising her arms instinctively, but there was almost no time to defend herself. I can't even imagine being in her shoes for a second. One moment you're walking toward the kitchen, the next, everything's chaos. It makes my chest tighten, just thinking about it. The animal struck with a calculated bite to the neck, its jaws clamping onto the muscles and airway with deadly precision. Its powerful forelimbs pinned her against the side of the barn, using weight and momentum to hold her down. Kamla twisted and kicked, instinctively trying to free herself, but the leopard's strength and skill left almost no room for escape. Claws raked across her arms and chest, tearing clothing and flesh, while the force of the impact knocked her balance completely off. Deep lacerations opened across her body, ribs fractured under the pressure, and her arms and legs grew quickly unresponsive. The trauma to her neck, combined with blood loss and the shock of the assault, rendered her largely immobile within moments. Just picturing her twisted and trapped with nowhere to go really hits me. It's scary how fast things can get out of control when a wild animal is that close. From the edge of the forest, Ravi noticed sudden movement, blur in the shadows, and sprinted toward the sound, shouting warnings. By the time he reached the barn, the leopard had begun dragging her slightly toward the forest, attempting to move its prey as it would in the wild. The sight was brief, just enough for Ravi to see the struggle, but it was enough to startle the animal. Without hesitation, it released her and disappeared quickly into the dark underbrush, leaving behind the aftermath of the attack: broken fencing, torn clothing, and a scene of devastating injury. Emergency services were called immediately, but paramedics confirmed Kamla had died from severe trauma caused by the predator's assault before help could reach her. Investigators later determined the leopard was a young adult male, likely displaced from its territory due to habitat loss and a scarcity of prey. Officials noted that repeated approaches to human settlements and livestock indicated increasing boldness, a behavior often seen in juveniles struggling to establish a range. The animal was captured and relocated to a wildlife reserve several days later. It's wild to think about how something so young and curious can turn deadly just by being hungry and bold. Makes you realize even animals we usually avoid can be unpredictable when survival is on the line. Kamla's daughter inherited the farm and took steps to prevent future encounters by reinforcing fencing, repairing gates, and limiting nighttime access to livestock. Local media described the incident as a tragic accident, while Ravi, visibly shaken, avoided working alone around animals for several weeks. The incident shows how quickly ordinary routines can turn fatal. It wasn't a single mistake, but a combination of subtle vulnerabilities, aging physical limitations, minor gaps in property security, and a predator learning human patterns. Leopards are usually wary of people, but juveniles needing food can test boundaries with remarkable stealth. When an opportunity appears isolated, vulnerable, and within reach, they can act with lethal precision, and in this case, the timing, environment, and the animal's strike left irreversible consequences in seconds. Even where I thought I knew the wildlife, this story reminds me to stay careful. Watching fences, understanding animal behavior, and avoiding the dark can make a big difference. It wasn't one mistake, it was human vulnerability and a predator's opportunity, building over days and unfolding in seconds. It was February 19th, 2017, near a remote fishing camp along a tidal river in northern Queensland, approximately 60 miles south of Cairns, Australia. The river was wide and slow-moving, the water murky brown from recent rain. Liam Callahan was 31, a fishing guide from Brisbane. He'd been working as a professional guide for 6 years, specializing in barramundi fishing expeditions in northern Queensland. He was experienced, well-regarded in his field, and engaged to be married in 4 months. By all accounts, he was exactly where he wanted to be in life. Liam was guiding 3 American tourists, 2 men and 1 woman, all in their 50s, on a 3-day fishing expedition. This was the second day of the trip. As they headed back to camp in the late afternoon, the tourists chatted while Liam focused on the boat and the water around them. Liam had worked in crocodile territory for 4 years, completed a crocodile safety course, and seen dozens of crocodiles during his career. He'd never had a close encounter and had grown casual about safety protocol. He often waded into shallow water to untangle nets or retrieve equipment without incident. That morning, the camp operator had warned the group about a large saltwater crocodile spotted near the boat launch, estimated at 14 feet based on slide marks on the bank. He specifically told Liam to avoid wading near the launch. Liam nodded. Later, out of earshot, he told his clients the warnings were mostly for tourists who don't know better. At 5:30 p.m., the group returned to the boat launch after a successful afternoon. Liam noticed the fishing net was tangled on submerged roots approximately 20 feet from the dock. The net was expensive equipment, and leaving it overnight risked losing it entirely. He made the decision to wade in and free it himself. The water was murky brown. Liam couldn't see the bottom. He stepped off the dock and waded in, the water rising from his ankles to his knees to his waist as he moved toward the submerged roots. The bottom was soft mud that shifted slightly with each step. His 3 clients stood on the dock 15 feet away, watching casually and chatting among themselves. One of the men was filming with his phone, panning slowly across the river scenery, without particular focus. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptiles, with adult males reaching 16 to 20 feet and weighing over 1,000 pounds. They are ambush predators capable of remaining motionless, underwater for extended periods, virtually invisible in murky conditions. They possess the strongest recorded bite force of any living animal. Their attack method is devastatingly efficient, lunging from the water with explosive speed, clamping onto the victim, and dragging them under. Once submerged, they perform a death roll, spinning rapidly to disorient, subdue, and dismember prey. The entire sequence, from lunge to submersion, can take only seconds. Liam was 20 feet from the dock, standing in waist-deep water, bent forward with both hands working to free the net from the roots. His back was to deeper water. He was focused entirely on the task. The crocodile had been motionless, submerged approximately 3 feet in front of him for an unknown amount of time. It had approached silently and completely without detection. The water exploded. The crocodile lunged vertically from below, its massive head erupting through the surface. Its jaws snapped open in a single, devastating motion. The entire attack unfolded in under 3 seconds. The jaws clamped onto Liam's head and upper chest simultaneously. The upper jaw drove into the top of his skull, teeth penetrating his scalp and fracturing bone on impact. The lower jaw closed across his chest and right shoulder, teeth punching through fabric and deep into muscle. His right collarbone snapped. The force of the bite lifted him partially off his feet, suspending him briefly in the crocodile's jaws, before it dragged him violently backward into deeper water. Liam didn't make a sound. The crushing force to his skull and jaw made that impossible. His body went limp almost immediately. The crocodile pulled him under. The water churned and turned red. Beneath the surface, the crocodile initiated a death roll, causing catastrophic joint and soft tissue trauma. The clients caught brief glimpses of blue fabric and pale limbs before the water settled. The crocodile surfaced once more approximately 30 feet from the dock. Liam still clamped in its jaws, then dove again. The water gradually stilled. Blood continued spreading across the surface. One client called emergency services at 5:38 p.m. Officers arrived 47 minutes later. Wildlife officers searched the river by boat using spotlights, but visibility was poor in the darkening water. The crocodile was not located. The search was suspended at nightfall. Liam's body was recovered 3 days later, wedged in submerged vegetation downstream, consistent with typical crocodile caching behavior. The body showed advanced decomposition and evidence of post-mortem feeding. Examination determined he had died within moments of the initial attack from massive cranial trauma and drowning. His skull was fractured in multiple locations. His right shoulder and upper chest showed extensive crushing injuries. Significant facial and scalp tissue loss was present. Wildlife officers set traps along the river. 2 days after the body's recovery, they captured a large male saltwater crocodile near the site. It was euthanized and examined. Human remains, including tissue, bone fragments, and pieces of clothing, were recovered from its stomach and forensically confirmed as Liam's. The case was ruled an accidental death caused by wildlife encounter.